Chapter 156. The emperor, who was sitting high on the dragon throne, watched the performance of the officials below. An almost imperceptible smile appeared at the corners of his lips. He waved his hand to dismiss Xin Chiwu and said softly, "Does everyone think Xin Chiwu is more suitable?" "Yes, Your Majesty." The officials all bowed to the ground, and their voices dragged out as a sign of respect. Qin Heng, the advisor of the Bureau of Military Affairs who had suggested Fan Xian go to northern Qi, looked at the emperor with some surprise, and quickly retracted his gaze. At this time, the officials all agreed that Fan Xian was not suitable to be an envoy, and that the emperor would probably change his mind. I, however, have a different opinion from you all. The palace immediately became quiet, and only the emperor's light voice could be heard echoing throughout the palace. They say that jade that is not polished is worthless. I am sure you all remember Fan Xian's grace in front of the palace that day. Although he is a civil official, he once had the bravery to kill an assassin on Nyolan Street. How could such a talent always remain in the quiet yamen of Taichung Temple and the Imperial College? Hearing this, everyone understood that the emperor had long since made up his mind. They just didn't understand why the emperor wanted Fan Xian to go to northern Qi. The emperor looked at the officials lightly and continued. He does not have enough experience, so he needs more experience. I think Fan Xian is suitable. Let him take care of this task. If the emperor said it could be done, then it must be done. The officials did not dare to say anything more. Only Lin Ruofu and Fan Jian had traces of worry on their faces. They would not deliberately hide this. As a father and a father, it was natural for them to have such a reaction. If they were to pretend to be elated and say that their emperor was wise, it would instead make His Majesty and the officials look down on them. Fan Jian. The emperor looked at the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue and slightly frowned. I am here. Fan Jian heard his name and was slightly shocked, and he quickly stepped forward. The emperor said quietly, I want your son to take up this task. Do you have any thoughts? Fan Jian was silent for a while, and then immediately came to his senses. He smiled and replied, I dare not have any thoughts. Do you not dare, or do you not have any? I do not dare. If you dare, what will you think? Outside the palace, the wind and snow intertwined. Inside the palace, it was as warm as spring. But because of these few words between the ruler and the minister, it became as cold as outside. The officials who were on good terms with Fan Jian couldn't help but feel anxious. Why was Count Sinan so out of control in front of the palace today? After a while, Fan Jian replied to the emperor, I have been separated from my son for 16 years. We have only been reunited for a few months, and now we have to be separated again. I cannot help but feel sorry for him. These two words echoed in the palace, but no one knew who would hear them. The emperor smiled slightly. He knew that Fan Xian was saying this for him to hear. However, this childhood friend of his did not understand the true purpose of sending Fan Xian to northern Qi. It seemed that only Chen Pingping understood him the best. It'll only be a few months. She'll leave in the middle of spring and return in early autumn. What's there to be unwilling about? The emperor did not wait for Fan Jian to speak again. He smiled and waved his hand, announcing the edict. The Minister of Revenue is old and weak, and has been recuperating for a long time. I hereby issue an edict of consolation. Fan Jian, the left Assistant Minister of Revenue, will be given the position of Minister of Revenue. The officials had no objections. Fan Jian had long covered the sky with one hand at the Ministry of Revenue, it was just that he had never been promoted. Some of the officials with a belly full of evil tricks couldn't help but mutter in their hearts, thinking that Assistant Minister Fan had just promoted Lady Lu, and now the emperor was promoting him. If the assistant minister had known earlier, would he have promoted Lady Lu many years ago? Of course, the officials all believed that this was His Majesty's way of making up for sending Fan Xian to northern Qi. Fan Jian knew that there was no turning back. His face calm, he went forward and kowtowed in thanks. The emperor turned to Lin Ruofu and smiled. "Prime Minister, your daughter is newly married, and I am sending Fan Xian away. Do you have anything to say?" Prime Minister Lin Ruofu smiled bitterly and bowed. The emperor and prime minister of the kingdom of Qing seemed to be on good terms, but in reality, the emperor's power was majestic, and no one dared to provoke them. He had been puzzled by Fan Jian's interest, and now that His Majesty had asked him, he did not dare to say anything. He calmly replied, "Fan Xian needs to be honed." After the court meeting, the emperor seemed to be in a better mood. He rode his carriage back to the rear palace. The officials followed the straight path to the outside of the palace walls. They all congratulated Fan Jian on his appointment as Minister of Revenue. From now on, he could rightfully control all of the Qing kingdom's wealth and resources. Guoyu, the Minister of Rights, joked, "Sir Fan, from now on, our salaries will be coming from you. Don't be too stingy." Fan Jian laughed and shook his head. Sir Guo likes to joke. Fan Xian had made fun of Guo Baokun a few times, but in court, there seemed to be no ill feelings between the two of them. As they walked out, Lin Ruofu coughed lightly and stepped forward. The officials bowed to the Prime Minister. They knew that he had something to say to his in-laws, so they parted. Lin Ruofu said quietly, "Sir Fan, why did His Majesty insist that Fan Xian go to northern Qi?" The two of them were now in-laws, so there was less pretense. Fan Jian smiled bitterly. "I truly do not know. Perhaps he really wants my son to be honed?" Although he said this, he knew that the damned cripple must have done something behind the scenes. But on second thought, Fan Xian temporarily left the capital, avoiding the crown prince and the second prince's attempts to rope him in, and waiting for the great prince to return to the capital with his army might not be a bad choice. Lin Ruofu seemed to have thought of this at the same time, but he had a deeper suspicion. It seemed that His Majesty cared a little too much about his beloved son-in-law. Was it really just because of Chener? The Prime Minister shook his head and smiled at his in-laws. "De Bao has been on the mountain recently. Thank you for your trouble, Sir Fan." "What are you talking about?" Fan Jian laughed. "We are all one family. In another month, when the flowers bloom, the diplomatic mission to northern Qi will leave the capital. When the time comes, I will have Wanner visit the Prime Minister's manor often." "Yes. These days, De Bao has not been in the manor. Changju's manor has been quiet." Lin Ruofu sensed something and sighed. "Master Fan, if you have some free time, you might as well come visit my manor." "How could I dare disobey the Prime Minister's orders?" Fan Jian smiled. Once again, in a secluded, deserted place, two carriages. Once again, the two schemers who had stood behind Fan Xian for over a decade were hiding in their own carriages, talking. "As I said, I do not wish for him to have anything to do with the Overwatch Council." Fan Jian, who had just been promoted to Minister of Revenue, sounded cold and indifferent. In the opposite carriage, Chen Pingping let out a low chuckle. "The diplomatic mission to northern Qi has nothing to do with my shabby council." Fan Jian couldn't help but lift the curtain of the carriage. "Nothing to do with you? Don't think I don't know what you're trying to do. Xiaofan is in your hands now. If you want to kill him, kill him. Why let him fight for his reputation? You and I both know what kind of person Xiaofan is. If he were to return to northern Qi, killing him would be very difficult. You should also know how difficult it would be. I haven't forgotten. You have a portion of His Majesty's power in your hands. I believe there are people in the council who work for you as well." Chen Pingping continued to chuckle. There seemed to be something sinister in his laughter. "I'm afraid His Majesty wouldn't like it if we met in private." As for Xiaofan, it doesn't matter if I kill him or not. I've squeezed his marrow for 20 years. There's nothing left. And the young emperor of northern Qi may not be as broad-minded as our master. Whether or not he dares to use the head spy of the former Wei kingdom is another matter. As for Fan Xian's diplomatic mission to northern Qi, it was truly the emperor's will. Master Fan, you know that if you let that child stay in the capital, he will be dragged around by the crown prince and the second prince every day. I'm afraid he will cause a lot of trouble in the future. Fan Jian fell silent. He knew this was a fatal problem. He could not allow Fan Xian to participate in the struggle for the throne. He let down the curtain of the carriage and closed his eyes as he leaned against the cushion. He still couldn't let the child he had watched over for over a decade have anything to do with the terrifying Overwatch Council. As if guessing what he was thinking, Chen Pingping said coldly, "Since His Majesty has agreed to this arrangement, you don't have to worry." No one saw the cold smile on Fan Jian's lips. Yan Bingyun has been captured. How will the council cooperate with him? Naturally, someone will take over. Don't send mediocre people. Chen Pingping smiled. Perhaps it's time for you to put in some effort. You must know that Dongyi sent people to the palace to assassinate the eldest princess's palace maid. Yi Zhong has always suspected the council was behind it. The news has already reached Xinyang, so it's a little inconvenient for me. Fan Jian's heart skipped a beat. Atop the Tsang Mountains, the snow was thick. White mist rose from the hot springs in the distance. The red-crowned cranes were nowhere to be seen. Fan Xian carefully read the letters his father and Wang Qinian had sent him, then rubbed them into powder and tossed them out the window. The snowy scenery outside the window was beautiful. Dabao and Fan Xija were making a snowman, one fat, quarreling non-stop. It was only at times like this that Fan Xija would show some of the normal behavior of a child, rather than a rotten bookkeeper. Fan Xian smiled. It was difficult to travel in these snowy days, but the Danbo bookstore in the capital had still sent people to the mountains to deliver the accounts. That seventh Yi shopkeeper was truly loyal to his duty. The bookstore's business was doing surprisingly well. Because of the release of Bangxian's high poetry collection, several branches in the capital had also firmly established their foothold, and the branches of Danbo bookstore in the neighboring counties had also begun to make money. Fan Xija had checked the accounts the night before. When he saw the net income of 23,000 taels of silver, his eyes reddened. He kept trying to convince himself to quickly release the last 10 chapters of Story of the Stone. But Fan Xian wouldn't agree. Writing poetry had already caused so much trouble. If people knew that Story of the Stone was also written by him, who knew what kind of storm it would cause? The eldest princess had returned to Xinyang, but she still had influence in the court. More importantly, he didn't know whether her ally was the crown prince or the second prince that he had never met. Chapter 157. Fan Xian strolled out of the study and breathed in the fresh winter air of the Tsang Mountains. Contentedly, he stretched. Following the sounds of mahjong, he easily found where his wife and the other girls were. Looking at the green mahjong tiles on the table, under the hands of those fair and delicate women, Fan Xian's heart skipped a beat. When he saw his sister, under the light of the snow, holding the poetry anthology from the previous dynasty that the second prince had given her, Fan Xian's heart skipped a beat. Being too famous really wasn't a good thing. Pigs were afraid of being fat, and people were afraid of being fat. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. Ever since the banquet, although the crown prince and the second prince didn't seem to have any contact with him, Xian Shaoqing and Li Hongqing, Crown Prince Jing, had often visited Fan Manor. Even after he hid in the Tsang Mountains, he hadn't been able to stop them from sending gifts. On New Year's Eve, the people in the Tsang Mountains had returned to the capital. In a few short days, Li Hongqing had followed the scent and pestered Fan Xian to go to the Tsang Mountains with him. Fan Xian didn't dare to agree. In the end, he had no choice but to bring Wuxia into the mountains. Seeing him in a daze after entering the room, the first person to notice him was Princess Wuxia. She said crisply, "Brother Xian, do you want to play mahjong?" Hearing the words, "Brother Xian," Fan Xian thought of Brother Bao. He quickly waved his hand and smiled. "Princess, please play. I'm just going to walk around." Hearing him deliberately say that they weren't close, Princess Wuxia pouted, but she didn't show her displeasure. She looked very pitiful and cute. Lin Wanner couldn't help but say, "Husband, why don't you play a few rounds?" "Forget it." Fan Xian waved his hand even more urgently, leaving the mahjong table. Unexpectedly, he bumped into something soft under his feet. He looked down and saw that it was a box. Inside the box was a pile of hay and rags. 3 chubby kittens were sleeping on top of it. The kittens squinted their eyes and wrinkled their noses. They looked very cute. Fan Xian was surprised. "What's going on?" Lin Wanna realized that the kittens were at his feet. Afraid of scaring them, she quickly walked away from the table and picked up the box. Naturally, they couldn't play mahjong anymore. She smiled and replied, "Mrs. Teng was afraid that we would be bored on the mountain, so she sent 3 cats over today." Fan Xian moved closer and found that the 3 kittens were yellow, black, and white. They looked very similar, but the color of their fur was very different. He couldn't help but laugh. "You girls don't even know how to feed yourselves, let alone raise cats." He reached out and took the black one from the box into his arms. Hugging it, he felt that it was like a small ball of meat in front of his chest. He gently scratched the back of the kitten's head. The kitten opened its eyes, glanced at him, and then fell asleep again, as if it did not resent his breath. "Do you have a name?" "No, let's call them Little Yellow, Little Black, and Little White first." Little White sounds good." After dinner, Fan Xian sat at the head of the table, and Fan Xixia sat next to him. The 2 brothers listened to the report from Fan Manor. At the end of the year, the Fan family's estates in the suburbs of the capital, as well as their fiefdom in Danzhou, as well as a few scattered businesses, all had to be reported to the capital. Lady Lu had always been in charge of Fan Manor in the capital. Now that she had been promoted, it was even more justifiable. But for some reason, after she finished dealing with these matters this year, she asked Mr. Cui to write a letter. She picked out a few important items and wrote them down. She then sent someone into the Tsang Mountain estate to inform the young master. Fan Xian could understand what Lady Lu meant, so he didn't deliberately do anything. Instead, he listened very carefully to the 3rd housekeeper's report, occasionally interjecting and asking a few questions. The 3rd housekeeper honestly finished his report. Fan Xian closed his eyes and thought for a while, then opened them and asked Xixia, who was next to him, "Is there any problem?" Fan Xixia touched the 3 pockmarks on his left cheek and shook his head. "There's no problem, big brother. But this debt has always been settled by mother. Why is it that this year, the 2 of us have to compete?" Fan Xian smiled. He knew that this man, who used to be a little tyrant, was very talented in certain areas, but in other areas, he was like a blank sheet of paper. The 3rd housekeeper respectfully said, the goods from various places should have arrived before the end of the year. But this year, the snow in the north and east was heavy, so it was delayed. Other than the southern fruits that were sent up the mountain last time, there were also all kinds of dried meat and wild goods from the northern manor, as well as the flower tea from the ancestors in Danzhou. The numbers were all written in the letter. Thinking that the young master, mistress, young master, and the princess are all staying in the estate, the mistress prepared all kinds of goods and plans to send them up the mountain in 3 batches. It should be enough to last until the middle of spring. We don't need that much. Just pick something fresh and send it over. 3 batches is too much. One more will be enough. Fan Xian casually said, but remember to bring more of the flower tea that grandmother sent from Danzhou. He often talked to Wan, and Ruoruo about life in Danzhou, and he didn't know how many times he had talked about the tea with the faint fragrance of flowers. The third housekeeper smiled and replied, "The tea has arrived today. The last 2 batches are mainly food and small items. They are mainly for the 2 young masters to stay in until the beginning of the spring examination." Fan Xian heard this very clearly. He secretly praised Lady Lu for being a good housekeeper. He didn't say anything more, and let him go and rest. The spring examination was approaching. As a 5th-level official of the Imperial College, Fan Xian had to return to the capital to take up his post. He couldn't always stay on the Tsang Mountains. After the end of the examination in April, the agreement between the 2 countries would need to be signed, and the secret prisoner exchange agreement would need to be carried out immediately. Everything seemed to pile up. Actually, from Fan Xian's point of view, the prisoner exchange should have started last year. Not to mention the torture that the captured Qing soldiers would suffer in a foreign country, there was Yan Bingyun, whom Fan Xian had never met but secretly admired. As the head of Qing spies in northern Qi, he had been imprisoned in an enemy country for half a year. Who knew how much suffering he would have to endure? It was just that the travel between the 2 countries was always complicated, and after winter, the northern border was frozen and difficult to travel through. That was why the return of the envoy had to be delayed until the end of spring. But every time he thought of Yan Bingyun's suffering in a bitter cold house, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a little less happy enjoying the winter in the Tsang Mountains. He had long known that he was the main character in this diplomatic mission to northern Qi, but he didn't oppose this duty. After all, if he could establish his own power in the Overwatch Council, it would always be good for his future. Whether it was in Danzhou or the capital, his 17 years of service had long since convinced him that he was truly a part of the kingdom of Qing. Fan Xian was willing to do things for this country, not for the court. That night, Fan Xian finished his routine training and returned to the mountain villa, feeling a little tired. He stuffed his night clothes, covered in snow and dirty water, into a bag he had prepared and tossed it to the side. During training, he would lie alone in the snow, chasing after his targets under the faint moonlight. His gaze was focused on a straight line, staring at the black rocks that had not moved for thousands of years, or the snow rabbits that were running rapidly. He felt very tired. And these days, after Wu Zhu gave him the sword that belonged to his parents, he disappeared again. So during the training process, there was no one to talk to, and no one to look at him. That feeling of loneliness and desolation was like returning to his previous life. The mountain villa was quiet. Only the master bedroom was lit by a lamp. Wan was waiting for him to return. Fan Xian smiled faintly and walked in that direction. The sun had risen during the day, so there was a puddle of water on the bluestone floor, reflecting the moonlight. He walked around it and jumped over the railing. Suddenly, his heart jumped and he stopped. He was standing at the other end of the long corridor, in front of his sister's room. Suddenly, his ears twitched and he frowned. His eyes gradually became fierce. He turned around and pressed his palm against the door. With a little force, the tyrannical Zhenqi immediately shook the wooden latch in two. Like the night wind, he floated to the side of the bed. The bed was messy, but there was no one there. Ruoruo had indeed disappeared. Fan Xian calmly put his hand into the bedding and found that other than the foot warmer, the rest of the bed was cold. It seemed that Ruoruo had been gone for a long time. His heart trembled slightly. Could it be that an enemy that he did not know had done this? But he still forced himself to turn around. With a clang, his left hand pulled out the slender black dagger and prepared to go into the night to find someone. "Brother!" Outside the door, Fan Ruoruo held up a lantern. Her face was full of surprise as she looked at her brother standing on the bed with a knife in his hand. Fan Xian was startled. Seeing that she was safe and sound, he couldn't help but relax. He couldn't help but close his eyes and breathe heavily. After a moment, he asked with concern, "Where did you go? Are you all right?" Ruoruo was wearing a silver fur robe, and underneath it was a single item. She looked pitiful. She looked at Fan Xian, as if she hadn't expected this. She couldn't help but be a little stunned. After a while, she forced a smile and said, "Brother, you're asking me with a knife. That's scary." Fan Xian smiled bitterly and shook his head. He put the slender dagger back into his boots and walked up to her. He held her slightly thin shoulder and said, "You're the scary one. When I walked outside, I heard that it was abnormally quiet inside. I couldn't even hear you breathing. You scared me." Fan Ruoruo smiled and said, "Brother, you're running outside in the middle of the night, and you say I scared you. Where did you go?" Fan Xian continued to ask curiously. Fan Ruoruo blushed and lowered her head shyly. "There are some things that you shouldn't ask so clearly." Fan Xian was startled for a moment, then understood. He smiled bitterly. "It's not like there's no toilet in the room. The night wind in the mountains is very cold. Don't catch a cold." "I know." Fan Ruoruo smiled shyly and pushed him out the door. "Your wife is still waiting for you." Outside the room, Fan Xian gently rubbed his cold fingers. The temperature of his sister's bedding showed that she had been out for a while. It was definitely not during the night. She must have gotten up and gone somewhere after he left the mountain villa. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but have a big question in his heart. But he forced it down and didn't ask any more questions. In this world, everyone has their own secrets. We need to respect them. Back in the capital, when they were in Danzhou, Fan Xian had taught his sister this. As her brother, he needed to set an example. Chapter 158. People were proud of themselves in the spring breeze, and the horses were anxious. Fan Xian, who had rested in the Tsang Mountains for an entire winter, finally led his family out of the mountains. There were 6 carriages lined up, and they had only brought a portion of their belongings. This time, they didn't see Guo Baokuan or any of the other noblemen, nor did they have anything to worry about. It was only the early spring breeze that made the girls feel intoxicated. Fan Xian was in high spirits. Spending the winter in the Tsang Mountains was a rare opportunity for him to rest after entering the capital. Whether it was in martial arts or in spirit, he had made great progress. Looking around, he saw that the foot of the Tsang Mountains was covered in a patch of green. Faint green branches grew from the winter trees, and it seemed to dye the sky of the capital with a lot of vitality. The sky was light, and in the distance, a black cloud could be seen. Strangely enough, the black cloud was very thin. Behind it, one could see the gray-blue sky, and above it were wisps of white clouds. But it still gave people the feeling that it was very dark and heavy. Amidst the sound of hooves, the carriage turned a corner and left the Tsang Mountains. The sun and the sky suddenly brightened, and the clouds glowed. It was a very shocking sight. Fan Xian withdrew his bored gaze from the sky and smiled at his wife. "Staying in the mountains for so long, I'm afraid you've been stifled?" Lin Wanner looked at him curiously. "What have you been stifled about?" Fan Xian was a little surprised. "Although the mountains are good, seeing only snow and trees makes me feel a little tired." "Wanner, don't you miss the bustling life in the capital?" Lin Wanner smiled, and a faint sadness appeared on her white face. "In the capital, if it's not in the palace, then it's in another courtyard. You know that I haven't lived in the Prime Minister's manor for long, and I haven't had many opportunities to go out. Although life in the mountains is monotonous, it's still more comfortable than living in those high walls." She looked at her husband's expression of concern, and her heart warmed. She giggled. "And you've always been in the mountains?" After saying this, Fan Xian didn't feel anything, but she was the first to blush and turn her face away. Fan Xian laughed, and then immediately thought of that matter. He warmly said, "When the matters of the spring examinations are over, the court will probably send me to northern Qi." It was quiet in the carriage. Only the sound of hooves and the snorting of the horses could be heard, and the sound of the wheels on the mountain road could be heard. After a while, Lin Wanner smiled and said, "Don't worry. I'm here in the capital." Fan Xian thought for a moment. "I think I'll take Wang Qinian with me. If there's anything you need to do, ask father's opinion first. If teacher Fei Jie is still in the capital, you can ask him for help. These things can be done through Teng Zijing. I've already instructed him." "Of course." He smiled and said, "I don't think there's anything wrong." Back in the capital, the colorful lanterns were still there, and the firecrackers and confetti in the remote alleys had not been swept away. Seeing all the pedestrians wearing new clothes and still immersed in the festive atmosphere, Fan Xian couldn't help but regret his decision to enter the Tsang Mountains on the 4th day of the new year. It seemed that he had missed the excitement of the first month's lanterns. When the carriage arrived at Fan Manor, it was inevitable that there would be a lot of trouble. The couple, who were neither old nor new, bowed to their parents and met with the rest of the clan. Only now did Fan Xian realize that the Fan clan lived up to its reputation. Although they did not have any high-ranking officials in the court, their distant cousins all seemed to be well paid in important departments of the court, and each of them lived comfortably. A few days later, Fan Xian first brought Wanner back to the Prime Minister's manor to pay respects to his father-in-law, and reluctantly bid farewell to Debao. Then he went to King Jing's manor to pay respects to the prince he was familiar with. Before he could calm down, the Vice Minister of Taichung Temple, Ren Xiaofan, and the Vice Minister of Honglu Temple, Xian Qiwu, invited him to 2 more banquets. These were officials he had worked with before, and he could not refuse. Fan Xian could only get drunk and end these 2 banquets. In the blink of an eye, it was already the 2nd month of the year. At this time, the scholars from various provinces and counties had already arrived in the capital. Those who had money found inns to stay in, those who had relatives to seek shelter with, and those who had no money could only make do with the scholars in the outskirts of the capital. Even the dormitories of the Imperial College had been opened for the scholars who had nowhere else to go. The examination was hosted by the Board of Rites, and was divided into 3 rounds, held on the 9th, 12th, and 15th of the 2nd month. So by the time Fan Xian entered the Imperial College to take up his post, time was already tight. Fortunately, his 5th-level official position was only in name, something the Emperor had randomly appointed in a moment of happiness. The Imperial College did not have any arrangements for him. The examination was approaching, and the Imperial College naturally did not need him to teach, so he was free. Occasionally, there would be students studying at the Imperial College who would run into his room and stare at him with greedy eyes like a pack of hungry wolves. Fan Xian opened the fan in his hand with a swish, and waved it incessantly in this late winter and early spring weather. After the students around him had coldly backed away, he smiled and said, "Everyone, I am still young, and I do not deserve to be called an educator. So please do not bring this matter up again, lest I embarrass myself." Seeing that his words were humorous and that this 17-year-old man who was already a 5th-ranked official in the imperial court did not seem to be the kind of person who would look down on others with disdain, the feeling of estrangement between the students gradually disappeared. Someone boldly joked, "Master Fan, when you first entered the capital, you once commented on the strength of character at Yishur Tavern. Now you are in the mood to fan yourself?" Fan Xian laughed and replied, "What does that mean?" "It means that I have always liked to fool around, and that nothing I say can be accurate." The court had long since decided who would be the chief examiner for this competition, as well as who would be promoted. Fan Xian was 17 years old, and a 5th-level official position was already somewhat shocking, but it was still far from enough for him to take on such an important role. But his reputation for poetry had already spread far and wide. Although he had vowed never to write poetry again, it seemed that not many people took him seriously. The scholars always wanted to get something out of him, but if they could get Fan Xian's praise, it would be a pleasant surprise. The Danbo bookstores, Bang Xian's high poetry collection, had long been sold throughout the country, so the scholars who had come from all over the country could not help but be curious about this young man whose name had shaken the capital. Some of the more impetuous ones actually managed to find the location of Fan Manor with their mouths. But looking at the front door and the stone lions, they realized that Fan Xian was not just a talented scholar, he was actually the son of a rich and powerful family. With such a strict social hierarchy, these scholars did not dare to rashly knock on the door to pay a visit, so they could only resentfully leave. Fan Xian had only been at the Imperial College for a few days, but he had followed his superiors around to see how the scholars had fared after entering the capital. He discovered that some of the children of poor families had indeed suffered greatly after entering the capital. Although the court had long since issued an edict that all of the major bookstores in the suburbs of the capital were open to the public, and some of the temples provided temporary accommodation, living in the capital was not easy. There were still some people who were so poor that they could barely afford to eat. Thinking of the story Wu Zhu had told him in Danzhou, Fan Xian's heart stirred. He took some silver from the bookstore's account and asked the shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall to help him settle the poor scholars' lives. Since it was not an act of kindness, of course he would not let the scholars know that he was the one paying. But when he returned home, he complained to his father, who had just been promoted to Minister of Revenue. Minister Fan found that his son was now concerned about these things, and he could not help but be a little surprised. Apart from a trace of gratification, he was more relieved that Fan Xian seemed to be content with his official career. On the 7th day of the second month, 2 days before the exams, Fan Xian stole half a day of leisure and snuck out of the Imperial College. He really could not stand those students who did not study the scripture seriously and instead brought him poems every day. Some of those students were old enough to be his father, and it was really quite awkward. Walking outside the palace walls, Fan Xian felt very relaxed as he looked at the clear water in the imperial gutter. To tell the truth, there were not many people in the capital who knew what he looked like, so walking on the streets was very comfortable. Especially as he walked under the red palace walls, Fan Xian squinted at the high walls and looked at the solemn-looking guards in the distance. Even his calm temperament could not help but feel a little proud. I have sneaked in before, so what? At the corner of the palace walls was a watchtower of the Imperial Guards, responsible for looking into the distance. It was from there that Yan Xiaoyi had shot Fan Xian down from across the palace walls with a startling arrow. Fan Xian retracted his gaze and shook his head. Yan Xiaoyi had now been transferred to the governor of the north. If he wanted to go to northern Qi, he would have to pass through his jurisdiction. He hoped that Yan Xiaoyi did not know that he was the assassin that night. Not long after circling the palace walls, Fan Xian entered Tianhe River. The water was still gentle, and the golden characters in front of the Overwatch Council glowed faintly. Fan Xian acted as if he did not see those characters, and calmly walked past, not even glancing at them out of the corner of his eye. I say, Master Fan, it is so difficult for me to even see you now. It seems that you have become very popular in the capital. Fan Xian smiled bitterly and turned his head to see Crown Prince Jing on horseback, looking at him with a smile. He cupped his hands and said, "Greetings, Crown Prince. I just wanted some peace and quiet. How could I have known that I would run into Crown Prince? It was not a coincidence." Li Hongqing waved the horsewhip in his hand and smiled. "I chased you all the way from the Imperial College." Fan Xian was a little surprised, but his clear eyes immediately became calm again. He replied, "What is it, Crown Prince?" The Crown Prince smiled. "Someone has invited me today." "Who?" Fan Xian's intuition told him that there was something wrong with today's banquet. The second prince, Li Hongqing said with a smile. Fan Xian shook his head helplessly. The second prince had never summoned him, but now that he had spoken, there was no way he could avoid it. Chapter 159. This was a private banquet, and the location was still arranged on a pleasure boat on Lujing River. However, this pleasure boat was exceptionally elegant, and did not have the exaggerated feeling of the red sleeves on the other side of the river. At this time, there was no rain or clouds on the river. The water was calm, and under the light breeze, the water rippled gently. Compared to the melodious sounds that could be faintly heard in the distance, the pleasure boat arranged by the second prince seemed to have an otherworldly feeling, like a lonely boat on the sea. Fan Xian and Crown Prince Jing, Li Hongqing, chatted and laughed all the way to the riverside. A guard pulled the horse, and the two of them extended a hand to each other, and then they boarded the pleasure boat. Fan Xian wore a smile on his face, but he sighed in the depths of his heart. This prince seemed to be an elegant person, but he did not know why he was not content to be a prince, and insisted on stirring up so much trouble in the kingdom of Qing. On the slightly wet wooden planks, Fan Xian's feet were about to step onto the side of the boat. Suddenly, the sound of strings being plucked came from the boat. There was no murderous intent, only a sense of purity and sincerity. The song gradually began. Leaving the green waters and green mountains, I came early to a bamboo fence and a thatched cottage. Wildflowers bloomed by the roadside, and wine was squeezed from the village trough, and we ate until we were thirsty. Drunk mountain children did not advise us, and yellow flowers stuck in our white hair. A smile appeared on the corners of Fan Xian's lips, and he walked in side by side with Li Hongqing. Listening to this song, he became more and more curious about what kind of person this second prince was. The bead curtain was lifted, and a young man dressed in green silk was sitting on a chair in a very strange posture. His head was slightly tilted, and his eyes were slightly closed. There was a very satisfied expression on his face, and he was listening to the singing girl in the corner. Without asking, this young man was the second prince, born to the current emperor of Qing and Lady Shu. The second prince's sitting posture was indeed very peculiar. He was actually half squatting on the chair, looking very much like a farmer resting in the fields. His green silk robe covered his legs, but what was even more peculiar was that looking at his intoxicated expression, his delicate facial features, and his whole body exuded a kind of elegant and peaceful feeling. It was as if he had long been tired of everything around him, and the past of the world was just a memory. When Fan Xian saw the second prince, his first thought was, "This man feels so familiar." His second thought was that this person was very tired, and his heart was very tired. His third thought was that this person's mind was very heavy. He believed in his ability to read people, but the situation was a bit awkward. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw that Crown Prince Li Hongqing had already quietly picked a chair and sat down. He stood in the middle, looking at the second prince, not knowing how to greet him. The other party seemed to be so engrossed in listening to the music that he forgot that he was a guest. Of course, with his identity, it was only natural for him to wait for a while. The song finally came to an end. The female singer held her zither horizontally, bowed slowly to each of the three people in the hall, and silently retreated into the back room. The second prince, who was squatting on the chair, seemed to be still immersed in the sound of the zither. He didn't come back to his senses for a long time. His eyes were still closed, and his right hand, suspended in the air, slowly moved to the side. He touched the plate of grapes on the table. 2 fingers pinched the grape stem and picked up a bunch. He raised it high in the air like a child. He raised his head, opened his lips, and closed his teeth. Slowly, he bit off a verdant grape. He chewed twice and swallowed. His throat moved beautifully. It seemed that even eating grapes was a very enjoyable thing. Fan Xian was not in a hurry. He looked at the prince with a slight smile. His eyes were calm, but he didn't let go of any of the other's small movements. He was trying to see what kind of person he was. A moment later, the second prince sighed and placed the grape in his hand back onto the plate. Only then did he slowly open his eyes. He seemed to have just realized that the guest he had invited had arrived on the boat. A strange smile involuntarily flashed through his eyes. The corners of his mouth twitched slightly, and a somewhat bashful smile blossomed. Fan Xian's heart jumped. That familiar feeling grew stronger and stronger. The second prince looked calmly at Fan Xian standing in front of him. He suddenly opened his mouth and asked, "Since you've come, why don't you sit?" Crown Prince Li Hongqing sat to the side, smiling and drinking tea. He didn't say anything to help Fan Xian. Fan Xian returned a warm smile and bowed to the second prince. "Your Highness, if I don't bow, I wouldn't dare to sit." The second prince looked at Fan Xian with a slight smile. "I didn't welcome you, so you don't have to bow to me." Fan Xian smiled. "Your Highness doesn't need to welcome me. I have to bow to your Highness." The second prince smiled and shook his head. He wiped his right hand, which was stained with grape juice, carelessly on his green silk robe. "On this boat, there are only me and my brother Hongqing, as well as your brother-in-law. There aren't any princes or officials." Fan Xian chuckled and cupped his hands in salute. He didn't say anything more. He sat down in the chair across from Crown Prince Li Hongqing. Since the second prince liked to play the role of a famous scholar, although he wasn't good at it, he could still sit in a sedan chair. In reality, the conversation between the two of them didn't have any deep meaning. But Fan Xian still felt that it was very strange. Because the second prince spoke very slowly, and every time he opened his mouth, it was always half a beat slower than the average person. So when they spoke, it always felt as if the other person spoke suddenly. And what Fan Xian found even more interesting was that the more he looked at the second prince, the more familiar he felt. But he didn't know where this feeling of familiarity came from. He was very sure that it wasn't because of Wan, I paid for this pleasure boat. What do you think?" The second prince seemed eager to know how Fan Xian felt about this pleasure boat. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He then looked around at the decorations of the boat. He found that whether it was the layout, the green pots in the corners, or the paintings hanging diagonally, this pleasure boat didn't seem like a pleasure boat. It seemed more like a study. He couldn't help but shake his head and smile. "Your Highness, this pleasure boat is very quiet. It doesn't fit with the word flower." The second prince smiled lightly and raised his head to look at him. "Quiet is good." Fan Xian suddenly felt that this kind of conversation was a bit boring and difficult. He was just about to turn his gaze to Li Hongqing, whom he was familiar with, for help when he heard Crown Prince Jing's words ring out. "I say, can you two not talk so tiredly?" Li Hongqing smiled and interrupted. The second prince chuckled and said to Fan Xian, "Do you see? Don't think that us royal children are boring people. Besides, you are already married to Wan. We are family. In the future, you should see each other more often." Li Hongqing laughed before Fan Xian could. "Our manner is one thing, but you are the second prince. You will be in danger if you go out." All three of them knew that he was talking about Fan Xian's attempt on Nyolan Street by a northern Qi assassin on his way to the second prince's banquet a few months ago. The three of them looked at each other. Thinking of all the things that had happened a few months ago, they couldn't help but feel a strange feeling. They all laughed at the same time. Once the laughter stopped, that matter was probably over. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. Although the second prince didn't hold a banquet at Hongmen, to have a meal and have to take such great risks is indeed scary. Hearing the words banquet at Hongmen, the second prince and Li Hongqing couldn't help but be slightly startled. They hid it well on their faces. Naturally, they had never heard of this story. But because of their noble statuses, they couldn't ask. The second prince smiled slightly. Don't call me Your Highness. You can call me second brother like Wan, Fan Xian's expression didn't change, but he felt that it was troublesome. If they were to get too close to each other, there seemed to be some problems. As if guessing what he was worried about, the second prince dropped his hands in front of his knees. Still half crouching, he smiled. You don't need to be too cautious. Wan is the treasure of the palace. You must remember that you now have an older brother who is still playing on horseback in the west. I, the second brother, am still hiding in Hanlin Academy editing books. As for the third brother of the crown prince, you must get closer to him. Does having more relatives bother you so much? Fan Xian smiled. These royal relatives were, of course, the source of great trouble. He replied, this is my good fortune. But it does feel a bit rude not to call you Your Highness. The second prince smiled bitterly. Go home and ask Wan how she calls me. After exchanging greetings, the banquet began. The table was filled with seasonal vegetables and exquisite side dishes. Fan Xian ate happily. He had long since drawn up a plan, so after familiarizing himself, he relaxed his mind. At the banquet, the three of them chatted casually about the past of the people in the capital and the works of the predecessors. The second prince was indeed deeply influenced by Lady Shu. He was well versed in the ways of literature, and he and Fan Xian got along quite well. Li Hongqing, on the other hand, talked about the wonderful stories of women and cosmetics, and couldn't help but mention Count Sinan's glorious military exploits. Once men started talking, although the second prince and Fan Xian found it inconvenient to speak, the atmosphere became lively. Fan Xian, on the other hand, kept a low profile. He only talked about the stories of Danzhou and what he had seen along the way. After the banquet, the second prince and Fan Xian both smiled and said their goodbyes. The second prince didn't send them off. He continued to crouch in his chair. For a long time, he actually maintained this position without moving. He watched Fan Xian and Li Hongqing's figures disappear from the door of the pleasure boat. Only then did he quietly sigh. Your Highness, what do you think of Sir Fan Jr.? Asked the disciple of the second prince's relative respectfully. The second prince smiled slightly. This brother-in-law is too cautious. He doesn't have any of the arrogance and wildness that the people of Qing have nurtured in their bones for decades. To tell the truth, I really wonder if the young Fan who went crazy with poetry at the banquet is the same person I met today. Having said this, he habitually lowered his head and stretched his hand to the side to touch the bunch of green grapes. The disciple immediately knew that the second prince was thinking about some extremely important matters of state. Not daring to disturb him, he quickly and quietly left through the door. After a long time, the second prince slowly raised his head. His eyes were filled with confusion. In reality, he wasn't thinking about any important matters of state. He was just thinking about the feast at Hongmen that Fan Xian had mentioned at the beginning. He had read the classics with his mother when he was young, but he still couldn't remember what this feast at Hongmen was. My brother-in-law is indeed very knowledgeable. It looks like I'll have to go back and do some research. The second prince bit down on the green grapes in his mouth. The juice was incredibly sweet and sour. Note 1, Yuan Chu Lu Ji was intoxicated by the east wind. Living in leisure. I am slowly recovering my spirit in leisure. Chapter 160. Fan Xian sat on his horse, his buttocks uncomfortable from the kick. He smiled as he thought about the second prince, and the sense of familiarity still lingered in his heart. Of course, he knew that this was the first time they had met. As for the matter of the palace treasury, there was no need to bring it up. It was just a meeting. He plucked the tender willow branch in front of him and asked Li Hongqing, "Did the second prince want to see me today?" Li Hongqing smiled. He is your admirer. Coincidentally, you married Princess Chen, so he used the excuse of seeing my brother-in-law to see what the immortal poet was like. Fan Xian was startled. He had not expected this to be the reason. He smiled bitterly and shook his head. After a while, he sighed. Why does the second prince look so familiar to me? Li Hongqing had known him for many months. He knew that Fan Xian was tough to the bone and gentle on the surface, but other than the occasional crazy outbursts, he managed to maintain a calm appearance. Seeing that Fan Xian was a little absent-minded, Li Hongqing couldn't help but mutter, "You haven't met him before." Fan Xian smiled bitterly and shook his head. Although the second prince was handsome, he was not Sister Lin. Fan Xian did not have a good taste for romance. Why was he so obsessed with him? He couldn't help but smile shyly. Li Hongqing was looking at him curiously. When he saw Fan Xian smile, he suddenly froze. He stared blankly for a long time before murmuring, "I know why you find the second prince familiar." Fan Xian's eyes widened. "Why?" he asked curiously. Li Hongqing made a vomiting face. "Because you too sometimes like to smile shyly like girls." Fan Xian was surprised. He quickly wiped the smile from his lips. "That's it?" Li Hongqing looked at Fan Xian's beautiful face and suddenly felt a wave of disgust. He said, "The temperament on your bodies is also similar. You are indeed very feminine." "Nonsense." Fan Xian didn't know whether to laugh or cry, but then he thought of something. Perhaps, the second prince was very similar to him in some ways. He shook his head and chased away the shocking question that had been plaguing his mind. He smiled again and made another attempt to disgust the crown prince. Then he waved his whip and urged the horse to gallop toward the capital. As he rode along the river, the horse galloped at high speed. The spring wind blew against his face, and so did the verdant willows on the riverbank. Fan Xian was too lazy to avoid them, and so he directed his tyrannical zhenqi to his face, using it all as a shameless act. He shook off the willows and rode happily. Not long after, he had shaken off the air and the guard. The horse was a little tired and gradually slowed down. Sitting on the horse, Fan Xian unconsciously turned his head to look at the water. He saw that he had already made a detour and had come to a place where there were many pleasure boats. In the distance, there was a pleasure boat that was already covered in dust. It leaned against the shore in a desolate manner. Compared to the beautiful patrons on the river and the prostitutes' boats, it looked even more miserable. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly. He guessed that it must be Si Ling's pleasure boat. This pleasure boat had once carried the most popular woman in the capital, and it was the most popular place in the capital. Now it had become like this. Seeing the scene in front of him, he couldn't help but think of Si Lily, who was still languishing in the prison of the Overwatch Council. After the spring examinations, the Qing court would release Si Lily back to northern Qi. Coincidentally, he was also the organizer of this event. He didn't know what it would be like when they met again. Back when he was in prison, he had used drugs, words, and psychological attacks to trick the woman into revealing that the mastermind behind his assassination attempt was Wu Boan. He had promised to let her go and had even sworn an extremely vicious oath. Originally, Fan Xian had not planned to admit to anything. He hadn't expected things to turn out like this. The corners of his mouth opened slightly, and just as Li Hongqing had said, he smiled warmly. He thought that this was a promise he had made. Behind him came the hurried sound of hooves. Li Hongqing had also shaken off the guards and followed them alone. The two horses stopped at the same time by the water's edge. They quietly watched the peaceful and magnificent scenery on the lake, occasionally glancing at the place of decay. After a while, Li Hongqing said quietly, "The night you beat up Guobaoquan, you drank with me on that pleasure boat." Fan Xian smiled and said, "We even spent a night on that pleasure boat." "What?" Li Hongqing looked at him. Don't tell me you're feeling tender and protective feelings for the fairer sex again. Your status now is different from mine. Not to mention Sea Lily, who is still in prison. There are many lovely people on the water. If you were as happy as I am every night, I'm afraid the palace would send palace guards to beat you up the next day. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. I don't have such thoughts. I just felt something when I looked at that pleasure boat. Wu Boan is not one of your father-in-law's people. Li Hongqing thought he didn't know these secrets, so he reminded him in a quiet voice. I know. They are the eldest princess's people, Fan Xian replied quietly. But since the eldest princess is no longer in the capital, I can't be bothered to think about these questions. Don't forget, the eldest princess is on good terms with the empress. She is most favored by the empress dowager, and, all these years, the crown prince has always trusted her. Li Hongqing looked at him quietly, as if he wanted to use these words to express something. Fan Xian smiled. Just say what you want to say. The second prince and I have just met, and there are some things that are not convenient to say. Since I've shaken off the guards, I want to speak with you in private. The two horses slowly walked forward, their heads occasionally rubbing against each other to show their affection. Li Hongqing pulled out the green willow branch in front of him and said quietly, after you return from northern Qi, you will probably be in charge of the palace treasury. Whether it is the Eastern Palace or the second prince, they all need you. I think you understand this. Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything, listening to him continue. Although the Eastern Palace is showing goodwill to you now, that is because the eldest princess has left the capital. Although I don't know why the eldest princess hates you so much, I know that in the eyes of the Eastern Palace, 1,000 of you are not worth a single word from the eldest princess. So you cannot trust the Eastern Palace. Li Hongqing said very seriously, our families have been friends for generations. You and I can be considered friends, so I want to remind you that if it really comes down to it, whether for public or private reasons, I hope you will lean to that side. He pointed at a lone mountain on the other side of the river. The back of the mountain was cut off by a forest, forming the character, too. What a coincidence. Fan Xian followed the direction of his finger and smiled bitterly as he shook his head. Lining up is a very stupid thing to do. Hongqing, I advise you not to line up too early. It's not a coincidence. That is the second prince's courtyard. Li Hongqing smiled. What you say is very similar to what my father said. But there are always many things to do in this world. Fan Xian shook his head in disagreement. After seeing the second prince today, I feel very strange. He is like a crystal. Why is he not willing to be like King Jing and be a peaceful prince? When Li Hongqing heard him mention his father, his eyes gradually grew cold. The warm smile of the past, like the spring breeze, also disappeared. He said lightly, there are no private matters in the emperor's family. There are many things that you cannot hide from even if you want to. You should remember how the previous emperor, who was my grandfather, ascended to the throne. 2 princes were assassinated on the same day. Back then, there was a storm of blood in Jingdo. If you could go back in time, wouldn't you also ask them why they wouldn't let you go? Fan Xian felt a chill in his heart. He forced a smile to hide his emotions. Back then, the country had just been founded, and it was not the same as the current peaceful scene. If the second prince had been willing to let you go, the Eastern Palace would not have done anything. Look at King Jing growing flowers and grass in his manor every day. Isn't he also very happy? The second prince can see that he really likes literature. Why can't he learn from your father? You've seen the emperor, and you've seen the eldest princess. My father is ranked second, but look at his appearance. He is already an old man. Li Hongqing said with a smile that was not quite a smile. Would giving way really have a good result? My father always has a grievance in his heart. Although I don't know the reason, I think it must be because of the emperor's family. In reality, Crown Prince Jing had guessed the real reason why King Jing was now a gardener. Fan Xian frowned. But you shouldn't have followed the second prince so closely. No matter how you look at it, he is the most unlikely person. In reality, given his friendship with Li Hongcheng, these words were already too direct. After Li Hongcheng heard this, he was slightly startled. Then a smile rose to his face. He knew that Fan Xian truly considered him a friend. In a quiet voice, he was moved. If parents bring some desserts and place them in front of the children, we must first indicate that we want to eat them. Then, when the parents distribute the food, they will first think of you. Fan Xian smiled. The second prince has always been expressing his attitude. Correct. Li Hongcheng's gaze left Fan Xian's face. Across the small mountain on the other side of the Lujing River, he looked at the faintly visible Tsang mountain range in the distant sky. In a quiet voice, he said, "The previous emperor was lucky because he only had 2 sons. The emperor is also lucky because he only has 3 sons. But, when the great prince returns, who knows what problems will arise. So the second prince must be the first to express his attitude and fight for all the power he can. I still don't understand why you chose him. The reason is simple." Li Hongcheng smiled. "I find him more pleasing to the eye." Fan Xian raised his eyebrows. He knew that the truth of these words could be counted as 3 out of 7. He could not completely believe it. But his eyes looked at the warm smile on Crown Prince Jing's face, and his face showed no expression. He was not a noble man who wished to be good to himself. He knew that there were many things in this world that he could not avoid, so from the beginning, he had never thought of hiding. A man in this world should be happy. Of course, in this process, there might be more to it. Before entering the city, Li Hongcheng very naturally said that he wanted to go sit in a certain restaurant. Fan Xian was too lazy to accompany him, so he raised his hand to bid farewell. As he said goodbye, the crown prince, who loved to play with women, said with a faint smile, "Today, the second prince wants to see you first because after the examination, you probably won't be able to escape the crown prince's invitation." Fan Xian shivered slightly. He heard a hint of information in the crown prince's words. Although he did not have the qualifications to mark the examination papers, he would certainly be watching over the Imperial College and the Board of Rites. Chapter 161. That night, Fan Xian returned to his courtyard. He talked with Wan about his meeting with the second prince during the day, and then, as he had expected, another guest arrived. It was Xian Chiwu, who was close to the crown prince's palace. He sat down and drank tea. Looking at the names on the slip of paper in his hand, Fan Xian smiled. He knew what the crown prince wanted, but he didn't know why he had come to him. "Why are you showing me this?" Fan Xian held the slip of paper in his hand and shook his head with a wry smile. "Sir, I can't interfere with the imperial examinations. A few months ago, during the negotiations with Northern Qi, these two had been the head envoy and the deputy envoy. They worked very well together, and there was not much conflict in their personalities. Plus, the two of them had gotten drunk together a few days ago, so they were naturally more familiar with each other now." Xian Chiwu picked up his teacup and took a sip. "You should know what these names are." Of course, Fan Xian knew. The day after tomorrow was the day of the imperial examinations. At this critical juncture, all the manors were secretly communicating with each other like wives and grooms. The back door sills were almost broken from the trampling. It was said that even the head of the Board of Rites, Guoyu, was annoyed. He didn't want to offend too many nobles, so he asked for an imperial edict and hid in the palace. The other 4 examiners and supervisors had already treated the Imperial College as their own manors, and didn't dare return to their manors. But with the power of the Eastern Palace, if the crown prince wanted to promote some of his own young talents in the imperial examinations, he should have a way. Everyone knew that Guiyu was a staunch supporter of the Eastern Palace. If he just sent a word, there shouldn't be any problems. Why did he come looking for Fan Xian? As if sensing his confusion, Xian Qiwu smiled and shook his head. Sir Fan, you are talented, and everyone admires you. But it seems that you don't understand many of the rules in the capital. The imperial examination rules of this dynasty are all based on the previous dynasty's rules, and there aren't many changes. In order to prevent cheating, the examinees' papers have to be copied again to prevent their handwriting from being recognized. The most important step, however, is the step of covering their names. Xian Qiwu continued, the 6 names on the paper are all people I've met personally. He smiled. They are all talented people. Fan Xian had always thought of himself as a very calm person. But after Xian Qiwu left, he sat quietly in the study and looked at the note in his hand. He was still somewhat angry. The day after tomorrow was the day of the general examinations, and it was only today that he found out that, in addition to being the CEO, the teacher, and the supervisor, he also played a very troublesome and important role among the examiners. In their previous conversation, Xian Qiwu had told him that the court had already issued an edict ordering Fan Xian, a 5th-level official of the Imperial College, to be the clerk of the examination. The clerk of the examination was a rather strange position, but it was actually an official who was fully responsible for the order of the examination. He held considerable power in his hands. More importantly, after the examination papers were sealed, and before the officials of the Board of Rights and the Imperial College began to copy the papers again, the clerk of the examination was in charge of the sealing of the names. Anyone who wanted to play tricks in this examination would first have to deal with the blanking of their names. Even if the students behind them had bribed the officials of the Board of Rights, or even the examiners, if they did not tamper with the blanking of the names, the examiners would not be able to do anything. After so many years of the examination, the officials of the Kingdom of Qing had long become proficient in these fraudulent transactions. The distribution of power among the various factions had also become somewhat predictable. But because it was the famous Fan Xian who had inexplicably taken the position of clerk of the examination, the various factions in the court could not help but feel uncertain. No one knew what this young immortal fan of poetry would do. That was why the Crown Prince had unhesitatingly asked Xian Qiwu to come to Fan Manor first. He believed that Fan Xian would not go against his wishes. And these days, the Crown Prince believed that the Eastern Palace had given Fan Xian enough rewards. It was time for Fan Xian to show his attitude. Fan Xian looked at the 6 names on the paper again and smiled. He crushed the paper into powder and slowly walked back to his bedroom. He felt a sense of gratitude towards the second prince. If the second prince had done the same thing, he would have been caught in the middle. It would have been very difficult to deal with. But he had still somewhat underestimated the complexity of the matter. Lin Wanner sat at the table and smiled at him. She then gently knocked on the table. The white paper next to her finger looked chillingly clean. Fan Xian sighed and slapped his forehead. Don't tell me it's a person's name written on it. Lin Wanner giggled and stood up from the stool. She walked to his side and held his arm. You are indeed a smart man, my husband. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. I had thought that before going to northern Qi, we could rest and recuperate in the capital. Who knew? He finally couldn't help but curse in a low voice. Who made me a mediator? My father, your father. Lin Wanner looked at him bitterly. Although this position is not as important as a promotion, it is a very important position. According to the tradition of previous years, after the examination, the students will enter the court as officials. In the future, when they see you, they will have to call you teacher. It is a very important position. Fan Xian said unhappily, aren't our two not-so-close fathers a bit too enthusiastic? I'm only 17. In the future, when I go to court, will I have a group of pedantic middle-aged Hanlon scholars bow to me? Lin Wanner's worry was swept away. She laughed. Right now, your reputation in the capital is too great. This time, someone even recommended you to be a teacher. If it weren't for the fact that you were rejected by the palace because you were too young, you could have been the youngest examiner in hundreds of years. Fan Xian said, "It's not a good thing. Now I regret that drunken fit in the palace." But there was no medicine for regret in this world. He carefully looked at the paper his wife handed him and found that some of the names on it were familiar. They were all famous scholars in the capital. Some of them he had interacted with before, and they were indeed talented. Seeing this, Fan Xian felt a bit more at ease. Since I am the clerk of the examination, why did they come to the manor so brazenly? Fan Xian sighed and said, "This slip of paper is the evidence of their fraud. To send it to my hands, they are a bit too daring. It's the old rules." Lin Wanner had lived in the palace for a long time, so she naturally knew these things. She explained, in the past, although the clerk of the examination was important, the position was too low, so no one paid much attention to it. In any case, if someone in the palace wanted to cultivate a few trusted aides, the clerk could only pretend he didn't see it. But this year, it is my husband's turn to take this position. Those people are afraid of your methods and background, but they don't understand your temperament. That's why they came to greet you in advance as a sign of politeness and respect. Of course, those officials who think they can't curry favor with you will follow the old rules and go to the examiner's door. They won't dare to harass you. If that's the case, then all I have to do is follow the old rules. Fan Xian frowned slightly. He really hadn't thought that the Qin kingdom's bureaucracy had fallen to such an extent. When he thought of the students who toiled away their days in foreign institutions, he couldn't help but feel a bit uncomfortable. Do what you want. Lin Wanner was no ordinary person. She said quietly, "Even if you don't give face to any of these people, who would dare to do anything to you?" Fan Xian smiled bitterly. She was a princess, so of course she wasn't afraid of anyone. Although he had a powerful background, her brother, the crown prince, wanted to see how he would react. He turned to ask, "Who sent these names?" There were only 3 pieces of paper, not as many as he thought. Lin Wanner smiled shyly. "Actually, it's all because of me." Fan Xian was surprised. "What do you mean?" Lin Wanner replied, "I went to the palace today and sat in Lady Ning's palace. You know that when I was a child, I always played by her side. This is one of them." She continued to frown. "As for the other 2 pieces of paper, one was sent by Mr. Yuan by my father, and the other was sent by Sir Qin of the Bureau of Military Affairs." Fan Xian shook his head. Lady Ning represented the great prince, who was still far away in the west. Since the Prime Minister had sent him to the position of Vice Minister, there was no reason for him not to make use of his son-in-law. But as for Sir Qin of the Bureau of Military Affairs, although Fan Xian had never met him, he knew that he was a veteran of 3 dynasties, and a powerful figure in the military. Why would he meddle in the civil examinations instead of training a few generals? Forget it. It's a small matter. Since the whole country is full of crows, I won't pretend to be a red-crowned crane, Fan Xian said lightly. He destroyed all of the notes. Gently holding his wife's shoulders, they walked toward the front of the manor. On the 9th day of the 2nd month, the day of the examination, the scholars of the kingdom of Qing would sell everything they had learned in the past 10 years to the emperor's family. Whether the emperor would buy it or not depended on these examinations. The scholars in long gowns were like swimming fish, fearfully or excitedly heading towards the examination venue, the examination hall of the 2nd branch of the Ministry of Rites. It looked as if they were desperately trying to squeeze into a narrow fish basket. Fan Xian had already met with Minister Guo, the 2 teachers, and the 2 supervisors the night before. The officials nervously arranged all the necessary procedures, and the next day they went about their duties. An armchair was placed next to the main door, and beside it were yamen runners and officials from the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian sat calmly in the armchair in the middle of the crowd, coldly watching the students walk past him. Students walked in front of him. No matter young or old, they all bowed respectfully. Those who knew Fan Xian respected his reputation. Those who didn't know Fan Xian respected his position. At the door, Fan Xian's ruthless officials had already pulled back the cloth curtains and begun to search the students one by one, strictly preventing them from bringing in prohibited items. Fan Xian took a sip of tea and looked at these students carrying bedding and toilet bowls to eat. They looked like poor village workers, and he couldn't help but shake his head. Suddenly, he saw a student preparing to enter the courtyard after being searched. He rolled his eyes and shouted, "Wait!" Chapter 162. Outside the courtyard, there was a sudden silence. Countless fearful gazes turned toward Sir Fan, unsure of what the student's problem was. Fan Xian looked at the student carrying the tattered bedding and suddenly asked, "Have you checked?" An official from the Ministry of Rights and an official from the Overwatch Council reported at the same time, "We have. There is nothing strange." The student raised his head and puffed out his chest as he looked at the young Sir Fan. His expression was calm, without a trace of panic. Fan Xian frowned slightly and asked again, "Did you check after taking off your clothes?" "Yes, sir." The official next to him saw that more and more people were gathering at the entrance to the courtyard, and couldn't help but feel anxious. In another hour, the imperial edict from the palace would arrive. At this speed, it would be difficult to let all the scholars in. At that moment, Fan Xian suddenly stood up from his chair and walked to the side of the calm-looking student. He looked him up and down and suddenly laughed. He leaned close to his ear and said, "There is something wrong with your clothes." He spoke very quietly, so only the student heard him. In the cold weather of early February, the student's forehead was beaded with sweat. The student's name was Yang Wanli. He had no idea how Sir Fan, famous for his poetry, had discovered his secret. Under Fan Xian's quiet gaze, he couldn't help but feel like he was about to collapse. Fan Xian suddenly smiled and said, "Go in. If you reveal it now, your 10 years of effort will have been wasted. But remember, during these 2 days in the examination hall, don't let me find out that you have used your clothes." Yang Wanli was pleasantly surprised, but it was difficult to suppress the lingering fear. With a sullen face, he said, "Thank you, sir, for your help." Afraid that this young, eagle-eyed scholar would change his mind again, he shouldered the tattered bedding, covered his face, and rushed into the examination hall. He had made up his mind that during these 2 days, he absolutely could not take off his clothes to look at the inner layers. Immediately after, Fan Xian warned a few poor students who tried to smuggle notes into the examination hall. Gradually, the officials around him understood what was going on. Although they were surprised by Sir Fan's eyesight and judgment, they were also faintly anxious. They were afraid that they would not make it in time. Fan Xian, however, seemed to be acting as an official for the first time. He smiled as he examined each of the students who entered the examination hall. He did not miss a single one. He removed many pairs of shoes, many hats, and many brushes with paper balls hidden behind them. He piled them up in front of the entrance to the examination hall. Only now did the students in the queue realize that this year's examiner was actually a powerful figure brimming with killing intent. He was not at all like the immortal poet Xia Man they had imagined, and would not care much about their cheating. Thus, they hurriedly retreated and threw the things they had on them into the gutter at the back of the examination hall. The leader of the Overwatch Council today was someone Fan Xian was familiar with. It was Mu Tai, who was temporarily in charge of the First Bureau. Hearing the reports from his subordinates, he hurried over. Seeing Fan Xian kneeling down without a word, he said with some embarrassment, "Sir, it's getting late. You have to hurry." The officials from the Ministry of Rights and the Overwatch Council saw how respectful he was to Fan Xian, and they could not help but jump in fright. They did not expect the Overwatch Council to be so courteous to a civil official. Only then did they think of Fan Xian's background, a prime minister, a minister, and a princess. Thus, they did not dare to say anything more. They only quietly listened to Fan Xian's reply. Fan Xian took out his pocket watch and looked at it. It was indeed getting late. Only then did he shake his head and stop this interesting game. Standing up, he spoke clearly to the hundreds of students at the entrance to the examination hall. "I am Fan Xian. I believe you have all heard of me before. Everyone saw me earlier. To avoid delaying the examination, I will not strip search you today." The students were overjoyed. Fan Xian smiled slightly and looked around. "Throw the things you carry on your bodies into this bamboo basket, and I won't blame you. If I find you during these 2 days of exams, be careful that I have people strip you naked and throw you in front of the palace walls, so that everyone under heaven knows how refined you all are." The students were terrified. Only now did they realize that the smile of the immortal poet, Fan Xian, contained a bone-chilling murderous aura. Thus, they all obediently filed in. As for whether or not there were more students who wanted to take the risk, that was a matter for the future. Once they were let in, the speed increased. Before long, the entrance to the examination hall was quiet again. All that was left was a floor of smelly shoes and countless scraps of paper. It looked rather miserable. The officials from the Ministry of Rights quickly arranged for people to clean up in preparation for the palace's edict to open the examination. They also had to set up incense tables and fire firecrackers. For a moment, they were very busy. As they busied themselves, they thought that Sir Fan Xian's conduct was indeed very different from that of other Qing officials. If he had ignored the smuggled goods, that would have been fine. How could he have allowed the students to take the examination after being found out? If this had happened to any other examiner, the imperial censorate would have caused quite a ruckus. But everyone knew that if Fan Xian dared to do this, he was not afraid of such things. Fan Xian sat in his armchair and smiled as he watched the busy crowd. He talked to Mu Tai, who was next to him. Mu Tai's position had risen a long time ago. He had always thought that it was because of Fan Xian, so he was particularly friendly to Sir Fan. "You have worked hard, Sir Fan. In a moment, when the edict is issued and the firecrackers are fired, please return to the hall to rest. This matter of inspection will naturally be handled by me." Fan Xian smiled and looked at him. "This is my duty. In a moment, I will have to wander around the examination hall. I have no spare time." "Sir, this is your first time on this mission, so you do not know. Actually, once you enter the examination hall, there is no need to worry too much." Mu Tai thought that this young nobleman did not know the unwritten rules of the examination, and so he spoke with a smile. Fan Xian suddenly turned and asked in a low voice, "Will you be going to Northern Qi, Sir Mu?" Mu Tai was taken aback. He had not been prepared for this, and so he replied without thinking, "The council is still making arrangements, but it should be a matter of the Fourth Bureau. I may not be able to get involved." He suddenly thought of something. Sir Fan Jr. could write poetry, but he didn't like it. Instead, he liked to run small businesses. He thought he had guessed something. He smiled and said, "Sir Fan, are you planning to buy some goods from the north? I can help you arrange that." Fan Xian laughed. It's nothing. I was just asking." Next to him, a subordinate brought them tea. Fan Xian made way for Mu Tai. Mu Tai asked curiously, "Sir Fan, it seems that you are in a good mood today." The corners of Fan Xian's lips curled up, and an indescribable expression flashed in his eyes. He seemed to be thinking of something, and after a while, he said softly, "Actually, I have always thought that studying without having to take an exam is the greatest joy in life. After entering the capital, what I was most afraid of was the exams. I didn't expect that in a year and 2 hours I would become a scholar. I can study without having to take the exams, and I can even watch my fellow scholars take the exams with great ease. So this is the greatest joy of life." The imperial edict came, the firecrackers sounded, the incense table was removed, and the doors of the examination hall were closed. The annual examination for the kingdom of Qing had officially begun. Fan Xian heard the heavy wooden doors of the examination hall slowly close behind him, and a sudden realization hit him. In his previous life, he had never taken the college entrance exam. At the time, he had thought that it was the greatest regret of his life. In this life, he was unable to take the exam again. Although it was easy, he still felt a little regretful. "Greetings, sir." Fan Xian entered the great hall. The cold spring wind blew in from the doorway. Fan Xian bowed to Guiyu, the minister of the Board of Rites, who was sitting in the middle. "The door to the hall is closed, and without your permission, it cannot be opened again. At this time, the students of the various prefectures have already received their examination papers and have begun to answer them. The corner door, which is responsible for bringing in food and water, is guarded by Sir Mu of the Overwatch Council and the officials of the Board of Rites. There should be no problem." Guiyu looked at the young fifth-level official below him. He looked at his handsome face and frowned imperceptibly. Then he smiled and said, "Thank you for your hard work, Sir Fan." He then turned to the 2 examiners beside him and said, "According to the rules of previous years, after 2 hours, you will go down and patrol the grounds." The 2 examiners of the examination were the Imperial College of Learning, and the other was a scholar of the Tungwen Pavilion. Both were personally appointed by His Majesty. Hearing Guiyu's words, they nodded and said, "As you wish, sir." Guiyu then turned to Fan Xian and said, "Sir Fan, your duty is to maintain order in the examination hall and assist the 2 examiners. You will patrol the grounds from time to time, and you will also have to keep an eye on the corner door and be ready to receive an edict at any time." The minister of the Board of Rites sighed and cupped his hands in salute to the sky. The examination of the spring examination is to select talents for the nation. We cannot be careless. Everyone, please be more attentive. Following Guiyu's words, the various officials in the examination hall returned to their duties. A solemn and tense atmosphere quietly pervaded every corner of the examination hall. Everyone knew that after several northern expeditions, His Majesty had shifted the focus of governing the nation to the rule of law. Thus, the annual examination was particularly important. A few years ago, there had even been a precedent of an incognito inspection, so no one dared to be careless. Furthermore, this year's spring examination was one of the most important moments in the lives of those students who were burying themselves in their desks, furiously scribbling away. If they could successfully pass, then they would leap into the Dragon's Gate. If not, then they could only return to their hometowns and prepare for the next year's provincial examination. Who knew how many people's youthful years would be wasted by going back and forth? There were also those who were stubborn and arrogant. Once they failed, they would linger in the capital and refuse to return to their hometowns. There were those who were defeated, those who wandered about, and even more who disappeared without a trace. This was the grand ceremony of the nation, the arena of life and death for the scholars. Fan Xian stood on the stone steps and closed his eyes, listening to the rustling sounds coming from all around the examination hall. He thought of the slips of paper the crown prince and others had handed him, and a strange smile rose to the corners of his lips. Chapter 163. The sun gradually rose, dispersing the chill in the exam hall. The nervous students finally had a chance to warm up. They kept rubbing their hands together to ensure that their handwriting would not appear too stiff. Calligraphy was one of the criteria for grading, so even though the exam had already begun, most of them were still working on their scripts. They were not in a hurry to put pen to paper. It seemed that most of the scholars in the exam hall were pitiful people who had once had painful experiences. Fan Xian walked around the exam hall with a smile on his face. He tried not to make any noise with his footsteps, so as not to disturb the students' thoughts. Strangely enough, when the students were solving the exam, they were often most afraid of the examiners passing by them, or of looking at their exam papers. But when these students found out that the person standing next to them was the famous Xiaofan Jr. at the entrance of the exam hall, they could not help but feel a little more confident. Fan Xian was not like the two lecturers and supervisors, whose faces were full of solemnity. On the contrary, he wore a smile like the light of the sun. Any student who dared to raise their head to look at Fan Xian's face always felt that the smile on Xiaofan Jr.'s face was encouraging them. After walking around the exam hall, Fan Xian returned to the corner gate. Mu Tai had already brewed tea and was waiting for him. Seeing Fan Xian sit down on a chair, Mu Tai lowered his voice and laughed. "It's quite stuffy, Sir Fan. It's most suitable to rest here. The corner gate is connected to the outside world, so it's not that uncomfortable." Fan Xian smiled. If he really went back to the main hall and sat with Minister Gua, he was afraid that he would not be happy, and he would not be comfortable either. As he sipped his tea, he thought of something strange. The Crown Prince had only given him 6 people on the list, but He Zhongwei's name was not among them. After he entered the capital, he learned that He Zhongwei was a student of the Grand Scholar, and also a hidden official of the Eastern Palace. Logically speaking, he should be participating in the spring examinations. For the time being, he put this matter aside. Through the many small doors, he cast his gaze towards the innermost part of the exam hall. He felt a sense of absurdity. He had only used his drunken stupor to act as Li Tai-bai, and had published a collection of poems. Now he was sitting here as an invigilator. Life was indeed a very unfair thing. Those students who were still diligently writing, if they knew that the results of the examination had already been divided up like watermelons by those important figures in the court and palace, what would they think? Time seemed to pass very slowly. Fan Xian had almost fallen asleep on the chair in the corner door when he realized that the sun had just moved to the center. The relevant yamen had already sent people to deliver lunch. Naturally, there were people at Jiamen to receive them. After carefully inspecting the utensils and discovering that there were no abnormalities, they carried 6 of the food boxes to the central hall. Fan Xian went to the central hall and ate lunch with the officials while listening to them talk about what had happened in the morning. In the southeast corner, the supervisor had caught a cheating student. The supervisor shook his head and sighed. "I've seen cheating students, but I've never seen a cheating student like this." He actually put the entire strategy book under his desk and copied it. He thought there were curtains all around, so no one would find out. How could he have known that the eyes of the patrolling officials were so sharp? Guoyu, the director of the Board of Rights, suddenly frowned. How did he bring this book in? Fan Xian knew that this was his mistake. He smiled and replied, "The inspection was too slow earlier, and the officials of the Overwatch Council urged me. So I was a little anxious, afraid that I would miss the time set by His Majesty, and so I made a mistake. Please forgive me, sir." He was asking for forgiveness, but he pushed half of the responsibility to the Overwatch Council. Guoyu looked at him and grunted. He did not make things difficult for him. After all, this kind of small matter had never been eliminated in the imperial examinations. He could not use this to attack Fan Xian. He only said evenly, "Sir Fan is new to this matter, and lacks experience. You all must help him." Fan Xian smiled and cupped his hands in greeting to the officials around him, especially to his direct superior, the Imperial College headmaster. Sir Headmaster, I am untalented and inexperienced. Please watch over me. The Imperial College headmaster was Shu the scholar, who had been pointed out by His Majesty that day in the palace hall. He was originally a student of Zhuang Mohan, but he was proud to be a citizen of Qing, so he did not hold a grudge against Fan Xian for provoking Zhuang Mohan to the point of vomiting blood. Instead, he pointed at Fan Xian and laughed. Sir Fengzheng, if you are untalented and inexperienced, who in the kingdom of Qing would dare to call themselves talented? The other supervisor and supervisor all laughed and agreed, making fun of Fan Xian. As the greatest scholar of the kingdom of Qing, if it were not for his astonishing knowledge, Sir Fan would be writing furiously in the hall right now. If he was hungry, he would be eating a few steamed buns. How could he be sitting here eating? Hearing this, even Guo Yu couldn't help but laugh. Fan Xian had no confidence in his own ability, but it seemed that whether it was in the officialdom of Jingdou or in the kingdom of Qing, everyone's confidence in Fan Xian was much stronger than his own. The students in the exam hall were still nervously doing their exams, and the sky was gradually darkening. Fan Xian walked around the exam hall a few times, looking at everyone's exam papers. He found a few people with real talent, and couldn't help but stop to take a look. Although he had read the classics of this world when he was in Danzhou, he had never thought about entering the official career through the imperial examinations. So if he really wanted to write such essays, he was afraid that he would not be as good as most people. But after all, he had lived 2 lives. To put it bluntly, he was a well-read person, and he had a good eye. He secretly memorized the names of those people, and then walked to the corner door. He pretended to yawn, and tilted his head. He found that Mu Tai was already half lying in a chair, almost asleep. He could not help but laugh. This Mu Tai was a wonderful person, and naturally had the ability to get things done. Otherwise, Chen Pingping would not have let him take over part of the power of the First Bureau. But his ability to conduct himself was lacking. Perhaps it was because he had just begun to learn how to flatter people, but every time he saw Fan Xian, he was incomparably respectful. For some reason, it made Fan Xian feel a little uncomfortable. "Sir, the corner door cannot be opened." Seeing that Fan Xian had walked to a secluded place beside the corner door, an Overwatch Council official showed a troubled expression. He stepped forward and stopped him. Other than delivering food and water, the corner door must always be closed. "I know the rules." Fan Xian smiled. "I just wanted to walk around and see if there was anything fun to do." His words were a little strange and out of place. This was the grand ceremony of the nation, the imperial examinations, and Fan Xian, as an examiner, wanted to find something fun to do in the examination hall. Strangely, after the Overwatch Council official heard these words, he smiled slightly and replied, "There are a lot of fun things in the council. Please come often in the future." Fan Xian calmed down. Looking at the official's ordinary face, he suddenly opened his mouth. "You are the person I was looking for?" "Correct, Commissioner," the official said with his head lowered. Fan Xian looked into his eyes. He knew that this Overwatch Council official did not have a high position, but he was certainly a trusted aide that Chen Pingping had placed in the First Bureau. He could not help but smile. Did Sir Chen say when exactly? After the imperial examinations, within 3 days, the official replied quietly. "Good. I still have something I need your help with. I need to investigate the backgrounds of a few people." Fan Xian told the official the names he had memorized earlier. "I don't want to investigate their family background, just their character." "Yes," the official said quietly. "Please show me your token, Commissioner." Fan Xian took out the token from his waist that had helped him countless times and waved it in front of the official's eyes. He then asked warmly, "Do you remember?" The official replied softly, "Yes, but I will report this to the director." "I understand." Fan Xian smiled warmly. Before sealing the papers, I want your report. Yes. Do I need to know your name? No, the official said quietly. The official quietly said, I am just a low-level official in the council. I dare not trouble you to record my name. The crown prince had to arrange for his own people in the court for a dozen years, and perhaps the great prince was doing the same. As for his father-in-law and the Bureau of Military Affairs, they were typical treacherous officials. Thinking of this, Fan Xian could not help but smile bitterly. His father-in-law really did not want to save him any trouble. But he also understood that this was the norm in officialdom. What he was about to do was a bit abnormal. Fan Xian sighed. He thought to himself, after a few years, when he was older, should he also arrange for some of his own people to enter this officialdom that was like a game? But right now, he could not do these things. The first thing he needed to do was to cooperate with the Overwatch Council and handle the imperial examinations perfectly. He did not want to leave himself too much trouble. After successfully forcing the eldest princess out of the palace with the message paper, he had handled everything calmly. If it were not for the fact that the Eastern Palace had used such a tyrannical method to pull him in, perhaps he would have continued to endure. And he did not think that his plan was too risky. Putting aside the power on the surface, there was a great grandmaster standing in the dark behind him, and a terrifying council. These were all powers that many people did not know about. He believed that as long as he did not touch the most fundamental interests of the Qing royal family, in this seemingly powerful but actually mutually restrained officialdom, he had a lot of room for himself. Since he had been reborn, he had to take full advantage of the situation. He could not give in too much. Otherwise, would it not be a waste of the fragrant helper his mother had left behind? If those princes and high-ranking officials could do it, why couldn't he do it? Not only did he have to do it, he had to do it beautifully. Deep down, I'm really a bastard. Fan Xian looked at the hard-working students in the exam hall and smiled. He thought to himself, if the monk can touch it, why can't I? Not only will I touch it, but I won't let the monk touch it. Chapter 164. What nonsense! Chen Pingping muttered a curse. The heads of the Overwatch Council at the table looked fearfully at the director's outburst. Chen Pingping pulled the blanket off his knees and coughed. His grizzled hair was a mess without a trace of beauty. He said, the rules of the council are very clear. We cannot interfere in the matters of the palace unless the emperor gives an edict. Yen Ruohai, the head of the fourth bureau, smiled bitterly and shook his head. It's a pity. In the past, we investigated the cheating in the imperial examinations, but these things always happened in high places. We don't have enough people, so it's hard to find any clues. Now that we have these names, it won't be hard to find the officials behind it. I just didn't expect it to involve the Eastern Palace. The words of the Overwatch Council had always been very bold and harsh. Other than their unparalleled loyalty to His Majesty, these secret agents didn't care about anyone else. Chen Pingping pushed the wheelchair to the window. His grizzled hair contrasted with the black cloth on the window, making it stand out distinctly. He coldly said, "This commissioner has a very good life." Last night, the emperor had just decided to investigate the exam hall fraud case, and he sent such a gift. Yen Ruohai was also very curious about this commissioner, who he had never met before. He didn't know how he had obtained the list of names. "We should have investigated it long ago," he said quietly. "Yes." Chen Pingping waved his hand and let his subordinates go to their manors to make arrangements for the big operation in a few days. He left Yen Ruohai behind. After a while, he said coldly, "There are many people who know the commissioner's identity, so this matter cannot be kept a secret. His Majesty still wants to save the Crown Prince some face, so we cannot touch the people in the Eastern Palace." Then the Prime Minister? Yen Ruohai suddenly had a flash of inspiration. He guessed the commissioner's identity, and couldn't help but be shocked speechless. Chen Pingping narrowed his eyes and looked at him. Since you know who he is, of course you know that his father-in-law cannot be touched, no matter what. Actually, none of these people can be touched. Yen Ruohai smiled bitterly. Other than the crown prince, one is a noble in the palace, one is the prime minister, and one is a senior member of the Bureau of Military Affairs. Our relationship with the military has always been good. We can't tear it apart over such a small matter. Yes. Chen Pingping snorted through his nose and said, we must move these 3 lines, but we must not pursue them to the root. Otherwise, the imperial court and the public will be shaken, even His Majesty will not be able to put an end to it. Perhaps these officials have guessed that His Majesty will not punish all the officials because of the exam hall fraud, so they have been so bold in recent years. He suddenly laughed, but that smile was a little cold. But they didn't expect that there would be someone in this world who was even more daring than them, actually betraying so many people in one go. Yen Ruohai frowned. What Commissioner Fan is doing is very inappropriate. He has offended so many nobles at once. How will this be resolved? He's giving me the task to do. It was hard to tell whether Chen Pingping was angry or mad. In short, he wasn't in a good mood. He knows that I won't let him stand in the eye of the storm. The reason why he gave me this list is to tell me that he doesn't want to be led by the nose. He wants me to help him deal with it. Yen Ruohai didn't dare reply, but he was even more shocked. What was the relationship between the eldest son of Count Sinan and Director Chen? Why did they dare to do such a thing? And looking at Fan Xian's expression, it seemed that he really was going to do as Fan Xian said. Chen Pingping regained his composure and suddenly laughed, but his laughter was a little sharp and unpleasant. Interesting. Interesting indeed. Yen Ruohai asked curiously, what does Commissioner Fan gain by doing this? There are always some strange people in this world who don't do things for their own benefit. Chen Pingping seemed to be thinking of something, and a rare expression of respect appeared on his face. Yen Ruohai had never seen such an expression even when Director Chen mentioned His Majesty. Sir, please tell me, what is the highest level of investigation into the exam hall fraud? Chen Pingping raised his head slightly and said in a cold voice, His Majesty feels that the Guo family has controlled the Ministry of Rights long enough. Understood. There is currently no one in the First Bureau. Mu Tai isn't smart enough, so you will take the lead. Yes. The spring examination had already entered its 3rd round. Fan Xian picked up a warm, wet towel and wiped the corners of his eyes. He found that he had indeed been a little tired over the past few days, and that his eye wax had grown. He couldn't help but laugh bitterly as he stood up and stretched. He then carefully looked at the students sprawled on the tables, sleeping. If even he, the examiner, was so tired, these students must be even more pitiful. Today was the last day of the spring examination, and Fan Xian had already spent a few days in the examination hall of the Ministry of Rights. Although his family often sent him refreshments and food, his body and spirit were exhausted to the extreme. He yawned and walked over to Yang Wanli's side. He carefully looked at him. In the past few days, he found that this student named Yang Wanli had been very well behaved. The things he had tucked in his clothes had not been touched, and he couldn't help but feel a little happy. What surprised him even more was that this Yang Wanli actually had quite a bit of talent. Although a few of the caveats were not watertight, and his opinions were not grand and imposing, they were practical and unpretentious, which suited Fan Xian's temperament. The unnamed official of the Overwatch Council had also reported back. This Yang Wanli came from a poor family, and he had studied in the clan school in Xuanzhou since he was a child. His results in the provincial examinations were excellent, and Fan Xian and he had a friendship that exposed cheating, so he couldn't help but pay more attention. At this time, Yang Wanli had already finished the last test. He was looking tiredly to see if he had made any mistakes. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw that Sir Fan had once again come to his side, and he couldn't help but feel a little nervous. Although they were in the examination hall, and Fan Xian naturally couldn't talk to the examinees, Yang Wanli's mind was a little dazed after a few days of torment. He boldly pinched the lapels of his clothes, and then gave Fan Xian a pitiful look. It seemed that he was asking the young examiner how he had found out that he had smuggled something inside the examination hall. Fan Xian couldn't help but laugh. With your talent, did you really need to resort to such methods? It wasn't convenient for him to talk, so he only used his right index finger to lightly point at Yang Wanli's bedding. Yang Wanli was confused. He looked down and saw the black bedding behind him. He then looked at the long satin gown that, although it hadn't been washed for many days, still exuded an air of nobility. His heart jumped, and he knew how he had given himself away. Just think, which examinee could afford to wear a washed silk gown and carry a roll of black bedding into the examination hall? He couldn't help but laugh foolishly. Fan Xian smiled slightly and made a decision in his heart. He put his hands behind his back and strolled back. It was already night, and the examinees gradually left the examination hall of the Ministry of Rites. After a few days of torment, everyone had long been exhausted. They yawned endlessly, and their bodies stank. Their faces were full of confusion. There were still a few slow examinees who were still bent over their desks, biting their brushes. There were also a few who had fallen asleep in their clothes under the lamp. It wasn't time yet, so naturally, the examiners didn't bother with them. Suddenly, a gong rang out in Tongtua Alley, to the side of the Ministry of Rites. The sound was crisp and clear, as if it wanted to wake up the night sky above the capital. The time has come. Students, stop writing. Following the shout, officials from the Ministry of Rites began to clear the hall, chasing out the students who were still holding on to their brushes. There was an examinee who was at least 40 years old. His hair was already white, but he still hadn't finished his exam. He cried and wailed, unwilling to leave his desk. In the end, he was tragically dragged out by several officials from the Overwatch Council. After a long time, the crowd seemed to still be able to hear the examinee's wailing, unpleasant voice echoing outside the examination hall of the Ministry of Rites. Fan Xian sighed, but there was no sympathy in his heart. In this world, it was the same in that world. What you could do, what you were suited to do, it all depended on your own efforts. It wasn't that he was a cold and emotionless person. It was just that to him, these students' exams were over, but his own had just begun. The night the exams ended, the papers had to be immediately sealed. This was Fan Xian's duty. The chief official, the 2 examiners, and the 2 supervisors all sat high up in the hall, not daring to leave. They all waited for Fan Xian to lead the people to complete the 2 procedures of pasting names and making a copy. Only then could they seal the papers. The candles were bright, and the entire second yamen of the Ministry of Rites was busy. In the outer room, dozens of old officials were dividing and organizing the papers. In another small room, Fan Xian rubbed his temples as he watched 2 officials from the Ministry of Rites paste the names. Before all the papers were pasted on, they had to first be sent to Fan Xian. Fan Xian didn't dare to be negligent. He carefully looked at the names on the papers, matching them with the names on the 4 slips of paper. After a long time, he had already picked out a dozen or so papers and placed them inconspicuously to his right. The 2 officials from the Ministry of Rites next to him lowered their heads and looked at each other. They knew that the dozen or so papers had been sent to the important figures in the palace. After finishing what he was doing, Fan Xian waved at the 2 officials, indicating that they should begin pasting the names. The 2 officials didn't dare to be negligent, and quickly began to cover the names and birthplaces of the students on the papers with paper. Fan Xian didn't try to avoid suspicion. He carefully watched from the side, and finally realized how these officials of the kingdom of Qing did this. It turned out that when pasting the names on the papers that he had picked out, the strips of paper used were slightly shorter than those used by ordinary students. Fan Xian couldn't help but laugh as he watched the officials from the Ministry of Rites solemnly paste a short slip of paper onto the exam papers he had chosen. If Guoyu were to find out in the future that not all of these exam papers had been requested by high-ranking officials of the court, and that some of them had been written by talented scholars that he had taken a liking to, such as that simpleton Yang Wanli, would Guoyu be so angry that he would vomit blood? What he didn't know was that if his little trick fell into the hands of the elders of the Overwatch Council, Guoyu wouldn't even have the chance to vomit blood. Chapter 165. It was a thin strip of paper that had very little difference in the length of the name. If one were to look at it casually, they would not be able to see anything strange. But if the transcriber was aware, he would certainly be able to tell. Fan Xian watched as Yang Wanli's paper was pasted with a short strip of paper, and for some reason, his mood became extremely good. He smiled and shook his head. He could not help but ask, even if they were picked out, how do I mark them when copying? The official beside him smiled awkwardly. He knew that this newly famous person still did not understand the rules. Carefully, he replied, Sir Fan Jr., when copying, as long as you work on the strokes of certain words, the person who approves the scrolls will naturally understand. Fan Xian suddenly understood, and sighed in admiration. That way, even if the person marking the paper doesn't know who it is, as long as he knows it's the right person, it's fine. Yes, sir. The official from the Board of Rites replied politely, but in his heart, he was cursing this world-shaking young man for not even knowing these old rules of officialdom. What he did not know was that Fan Xian was also cursing these people for being stupid. If it were not for the Qing officials being so arrogant, how could these loophole-ridden old rules have been followed for so many years? He would not have been able to use these loopholes to do things for those true scholars. Of course, he also understood that the reason the entire bureaucracy had always tacitly approved of this method was because, in this matter, whether they were political enemies or not, they had already tacitly approved of this method of dividing watermelons. Aside from madmen, no one in the system dared to cause trouble. In fact, the Eastern Palace, the elders, and even the Prime Minister all had other ways to arrange this matter, but they all came to him at the same time. One reason was because the middleman was responsible for sealing the names, which was an important step in the process. The other reason was that, apart from Prime Minister Lin, the other parties wanted to see what Fan Xian's attitude was. Fan Xian's attitude was actually very simple: screw you. After all, not everyone was as idle as Fan Xian. After all, not everyone had a good father like Fan Xian, and not everyone had a good mother like Princess Iron Fan. After a busy night, the civil service examination, which could decide the lives of countless scholars, finally came to an end. Many officials rubbed their sleepy eyes and gathered in the main hall, listening to the chief examiner of this year's spring examination, the Minister of Rites, Guoyu's lecture. Guoyu waved his hand tiredly to dismiss the lower-ranking officials. He then looked kindly at Fan Xian. You have worked hard these past few days, Sir Fan. I wouldn't dare. Fan Xian forced himself to smile. Sir, I wouldn't dare to say that. Besides, I'm still young. Guoyu smiled and said, everyone has worked hard. Actually, all of the high-ranking officials present understood the inside story of this civil service examination. Guoyu and the two teachers were not the only ones who had profited from it. Even Fan Xian didn't know that a few days ago, someone had already sent his share of silver to Fan Manor. That sum was even more frightening than half a year's worth of revenue from Donbo bookstore. For several days, the examination hall was filled with the rancid smell of something yellow and white. Fan Xian stood on the stone steps and covered his nose with his hand. He took one last look at the dark hall, and a satisfied smile appeared on his face. He had been in this world for many years, and all he knew was that he had to live, but he didn't know how he should live. It wasn't until he made up his mind to do this that he realized that being a good person in the general sense felt good. Of course, being a good person didn't mean being a pedantic old man. The officials of the three ministries had already gathered the examination papers. Led by the eunuchs of the palace, and protected by the palace guards and secret agents of the Overwatch Council, they traveled through the capital's almost white night sky toward the Imperial College. Within a few days, the copied papers would be finished, and the candidates for the top 3 would be selected. They would then be sent to the Imperial Academy, where the top 3 would be chosen. Fan Xian left the smelly examination hall. A carriage from Fan Manor was already waiting for him at the gate. After getting into the carriage, he accepted a towel from Teng Zijing and wiped his face. He asked tiredly, "Father, do you have any objections to what I did?" "No." Teng Zijing shifted his injured thigh and replied quietly, "It's just that the old master seems a little unhappy. He feels that you should have informed the Prime Minister ahead of time. Furthermore, the scope of this matter is too wide. If the public were to become angry, I'm afraid that neither the Prime Minister or the old master would be able to protect you." Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything. He still had the Overwatch Council behind him. More importantly, Chen Pingping had Wang Qinian pass on a message that the emperor was preparing to reorganize the government this year. He was just going with the flow. Chen Pingping was probably scolding him for causing trouble on the surface, but he was secretly pleased that he finally had a reason to make a move. Fan Xian only needed to provide the Overwatch Council with a reason, and then the council would present this reason to the emperor for him to make a decision. As for the Crown Prince and Ning the Talented, Fan Xian had other plans. Earlier, when he had copied the names, Fan Xian had chosen a few talented names to hide, regardless of whether they were from the Eastern Palace or from the Great Prince. He had protected them, and it could be considered an explanation to the other party. When the matter came out, Fan Xian wanted people to feel that he had done this not because he was biased towards one side of the government, but because he was a pure scholar who had made a noble and crazy decision based on some rotten obsession. In the following days, the capital was calm. Since Fan Xian had already revealed the truth, the hidden powers of the Overwatch Council began to cooperate. At least before the list of the top 3 came out, no shocking news spread through the officialdom. In the end, the people that Fan Xian had secretly stuffed into the top 3 were not eliminated. It was clear that in the Imperial College and the Ministry of Rites, there were spies from that terrifying old man, Chen Pingping, secretly helping Fan Xian hide. As for Guoyu and the other high-ranking officials, perhaps because they had been too used to cheating in the exam hall in the past few years, and because they had masters like the Eastern Palace behind them, they clearly didn't pay enough attention and didn't see such an obvious problem. On the 22nd of the second month, the spring branches on both sides of the road gradually unfurled, and the birds on the branches flew in pairs. It was a joyous time of spring. In an inn on the west side of the capital, not far from the Imperial College, students from all over the country who were waiting for news gathered downstairs in a panic. There was no wine or food on the table, because these students were not in the mood to eat and drink at the moment. All of their thoughts were focused on gathering information. No chance. A student from Shandong Road smiled bitterly and shook his head. "I think there's still no chance this time." "Brother Jialin, why do you say that?" The student sitting next to him had a slightly dark expression. It was Yang Wanli, the one who had met Fan Xian's eyes during the exam. He came from Chuanzhou, and often made a living by the sea. He was very different from those gifted scholars who were born into nobility and spent the first half of their lives in the study hall. It could be seen that his mood was very relaxed. He picked up a pair of vinegar-soaked peanuts from the table and ate them. As he chewed, he said unclearly, "Brother Jialin is a famous figure in Shandong Road, and his treatises are brilliant. A few days ago, after everyone read them, they were full of praise. As for me, I'm not good at this, and I'm not good at writing. Although I'm confident that I'll be able to make it to Muling County, I'm sure I won't be able to make it onto the list. Cheng Jialin came from Shandong Road, and this was his third time participating in the exam. He smiled bitterly and lowered his voice. Don't tell me you and I don't know these things. There are only so many candidates for each exam. The high-ranking officials in the court ask for a few, the palace decides on a few, and the Imperial College chooses a few. Outsiders like us may have some fame in our hometown, but what are we in the capital? Even if the court wanted to find a few talented people to serve as foils to shut the mouths of the scholars, there are plenty of famous scholars in the capital to choose from. How could it be us? The other scholar at the table had a lean face, and he did not seem to be a man of fortune. Perhaps he had drunk too much, and there was something in his chest that he could not release, so he spoke very boldly. He laughed coldly. Brother Jialin is correct. I think it would be best if there were no more imperial examinations in the future, so that you too would not have to waste so much money on travel expenses. What bullsh** T exam? It's just the high-ranking officials in the court choosing their own dogs. Cheng Jialin's face darkened, and then he became slightly afraid. He advised, Brother Jichang, keep your voice down. If the secret agents of the Overwatch Council hear us, not only will our careers be ruined, I'm afraid even our lives will be in danger. Brother Jichang's surname was Ho, and he was also a strange man who did not like to walk the path of the rich and powerful. Although he had a bit of a reputation in the capital, and had always been as famous as He Zongwei, because of his sharp tongue and personality, he had always been a little lonely. Hearing his friend's worried words, he could not help but laugh. Although the Overwatch Council is frightening, how could those secret agents look up to small fry like us? If they were really that powerful, why didn't they keep an eye on the cheating cases in the exam hall? Yang Wanli shook his head. Although the Overwatch Council has always had a bad reputation, when it comes to supervising officials, they are very useful. Ho Jichang waved his finger. How can there be an innocent official in the government? If we place our hopes on the Overwatch Council, isn't that asking a tiger for its skin? Yang Wanli retorted. Officials are also chosen from among the scholars. How can they all be bad people? I think. For a moment, he could not find any famous officials in the capital who were known for their innocence. He could not help but feel a little hesitant. After a while, his eyes suddenly brightened. I think Master Fan Xian of the Imperial College is a very good official. His two friends beside him naturally knew that Yang Wanli had been caught by Master Fan Jr. carrying something in his clothes. They could not help but make fun of him. So letting you finish the exam makes you a good official? That's a little too simple. The three of them joked for a while more, and as the wine went to their heads, they could not help but start cursing the abuses of the court in a low voice. They returned to what they had been talking about before. If the Overwatch Council was truly willing to investigate the cheating cases, perhaps the atmosphere in the exam hall would actually improve. At that moment, they suddenly heard a commotion outside the inn. The three of them stood up curiously, and heard a scholar roar in ecstasy. Cheating in the exam hall. Guoyu, the minister of the Board of Rights, has been stripped of his position and thrown into prison. There was a loud bang. Spring thunder roared above the capital, and a fresh spring rain fell on the bodies of the students inside and outside the inn. Chapter 166. Sparse raindrops fell around the inn, accompanied by the sound of spring thunder from time to time. However, those students seemed to be stunned, standing stupidly in the drizzle outside the inn. This alley was a gathering place for students from outside the capital on their way to the examination, so there were a lot of people here. After the previous shout, the crowd immediately fell into a strange silence. After a long time, some people finally came back to their senses and surrounded the student who had shouted before. After a long period of noise, it was as if an explosion had occurred. All of them were asking at once what had happened. Ho Jichang and Yang Wanli also showed expressions of excitement, but they suppressed the impulse in their hearts and only walked to the railing to listen to the conversation. There were too many people asking questions, but only one person answered. After a long time, the three of them finally understood. Last night, the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council had sent out over 100 secret agents. They had split into 5 groups and headed straight for Guo Manor in the south of the city. 4 groups had gone to 4 other residences and captured 4 Jiangnan students. Because they had moved so quickly, the news was covered up for the entire night. It was not until morning that the emperor announced lightly that he had already issued an edict ordering the Overwatch Council to investigate the examination hall fraud case. The court was immediately thrown into chaos. Only now did the officials know why Guoyu, the Minister of Rights, was not among the group. The only ones who were truly calm were the Prime Minister, the Minister of Revenue, and of course, Chen Pingping of the Overwatch Council, who had yet to attend court. This time, the Overwatch Council had acted quickly and accurately, especially the group that had captured the 4 Jiangnan scholars. On the spot, they had found letters between them and other officials, and in Guo Manor, they had seized an astonishing amount of silver. According to the preliminary results of the investigation, the 4 Jiangnan scholars were all from powerful families, and 3 of them were salt merchants. This time, they had brought large amounts of gold and silver to the capital for the examinations, and after a lot of effort, they had finally found Minister Guo's tutelage. Guoyu had already entered the prison of the Overwatch Council, and the 4 Jiangnan scholars had become pitiful guests. Since yesterday, the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council had begun to order the Jiangnan branch to arrest them, in order to make sure the case was irrefutable. Because these 4 Jiangnan scholars had nominally bribed the chief official of the spring examination, Minister Guo, in reality, most of the money had been sent to the Eastern Palace. Thus, the final background of this case was, the Crown Prince. Of course, the students knew nothing about these details. They only knew that they were cursing Minister Guo in the rain, not even sparing the poor Minister Guo's mother and son. It seemed that His Majesty was determined to thoroughly investigate the exam hall fraud case. Other than the Ministry of Rights, there were at least a dozen other officials who had been suspended from their duties pending investigation. According to rumors in the Jianghu, the reason why the investigation had been so quick and accurate was all because of a blacklist. On that list were the names of the scholars who had colluded with the court officials during the spring examination. The Overwatch Council had used the scholars to make their own deductions, and the results were excellent. Somewhat shocked, Ho Jichang walked back to the table from the railing. He raised the wine cup and poured it down his throat. Seemingly unaware of the spiciness of the wine, he said absent-mindedly, "I didn't expect this, I really didn't expect this." Didn't expect what? Yang Wanli and Cheng Jialin had not yet recovered from this shocking news, and they asked without thinking. Ho Jichang laughed and slapped the table heavily. "I didn't expect the Overwatch Council to act so accurately and so ruthlessly, to be able to get their hands on a list that could put the nobles of the court to death." He picked up the wine pot and filled the cups of his 2 friends. He raised his cup in invitation and said excitedly, "Come, let's drink to the Overwatch Council. Cheers." Yang Wanli and Yang Wanli didn't say anything else. They raised their cups in excitement. At that moment, the inn was filled with excited young scholars, inviting people to drink to their heart's content. The kingdom of Qing had been corrupt for a long time. Although everyone knew that it was impossible to completely change the situation by simply catching a Minister of Rights, as the saying goes, a journey of 10,000 miles begins with a single step. As long as His Majesty had discovered a problem and was willing to solve it, these young, energetic, and perhaps even naive scholars all believed that the future of the kingdom of Qing would become better. After a long time, the drunkenness slowly crept into his chest. Yang Wanli's eyes were glazed over, and he laughed somewhat foolishly. How satisfying. Even if I don't pass this time, to be able to witness such a shocking event, it can be considered satisfying. Cheng Jialan drank less, and he was also the most sober. He had always been passionate about his career, and he hesitantly asked, since the exam hall fraud case has been uncovered, then, will there be a retake of the exam this time? There won't be. On the contrary, after drinking a few pots of wine, Ho Jichang's thin face appeared calm, and his eyes became very clear. This is only a warning from His Majesty, and there are precedents. 12 years ago, when the world was first settled, there was also an incident in the exam. That year, 14 officials of the Board of Rights were executed, but the results of the exam were still announced as usual. Only those students who had relations with the officials were removed, and those who came later took their places. Then, doesn't that mean we have a chance? Yang Wanli laughed foolishly. With his pure nature, he thought of the problem very simply. There are only so many places in the top 3. Once those who took the dishonest path are removed, our chances will be much better. Ho Jichang laughed coldly. If it weren't for the fact that there were even more noble people involved, Minister Gua, who was only a minister, would not dare to tamper with the nation's grand ceremony. Those nobles would probably want to protect even more students, but they only removed 4 salt merchant sons. What good would that do for the bigger picture? The other 2 thought to themselves that it was indeed so, and they couldn't help but feel a little sad. After a while, Yang Wanli suddenly slapped the table and laughed. No matter what, this is still something to be happy about. Last year, the most sensational thing in the capital was that speech, which forced the eldest princess to return to Xinyang. This year, the most sensational thing is probably this blacklist, which actually overthrew a minister of the court. Cheng Jialan looked worried. Let's wait until the top 3 are out tomorrow, he said. Ho Jichang and Yang Wanli knew his temperament, and that he still had some illusions about this year's imperial examinations. They smiled and ignored him. I have to go pull that kid Shi Chanli out of bed and tell him the good news. Yang Wanli laughed. Remember to have him buy some food. Beautiful, very beautiful. Fan Xian lightly flicked the paper that Wang Qinian had brought over. He was in a great mood. Wan Er sat next to him and said with some worry, "Aren't you worried that the crown prince will find out that you were the one who exposed the cheating?" Today, Fan Xian, who had been severely reprimanded by his father, was, for the first time, grounded. He could only obediently stay in the manor. He knew that what he had done was indeed somewhat absurd. Of course, if he hadn't received news from the council beforehand that the emperor was planning to make an example of him this year, Fan Xian would not have dared to become this tainted witness and make an enemy of the entire court. In truth, the list of names was not much of a secret. Fan Xian had a few slips of paper in his hands, and all the advisors had a few slips of paper in their hands. Just by looking at this kind of open and above-board cheating, one could tell that the Qing bureaucracy had long since become accustomed to it. It was precisely because of this that the Overwatch Council's investigation this time was unexpected. For a moment, no one would suspect Fan Xian's head first. Hearing his wife's question, a strange expression appeared on Fan Xian's face. He said, "Your crown prince is too daring, and his methods are terrible. The entire court is also a group of daring idiots. Cheating in the spring examinations is a big deal, and yet it has been made known to the whole world. Even if I didn't report it, if His Majesty wanted to investigate, would they still be able to hide it?" Wan Er crawled out of bed and looked at his face calmly. "Husband, don't take such risks in the future. There is no wall in this world that can withstand the wind. If people find out that you had something to do with this, what will you do in the future?" "What will I do?" "Cold." Fan Xian made another witty remark that his wife did not understand. He smiled and said, "So what if they find out?" Wan Er sighed. She thought that her husband was well-educated and well-mannered. He looked calm on the outside, but no one could predict when he would do something so crazy. Fan Xian knew that his wife was worried about him. He quietly said, "The key to this matter is still in the palace." What is the imperial examination? It is a way for His Majesty to gather talents for himself. In the previous dynasty, there was an emperor who laughed during the imperial examination and said that all the heroes of the world had fallen into his net. His Majesty can tolerate the officials of the court using the imperial examination places to exchange for wealth, but he cannot tolerate all the places being used for ill-gotten gains. Furthermore, both the Crown Prince and the Great Prince have interfered in this matter. Our uncle, the Emperor, has to ask himself, what are his two sons trying to do? Wan did not quite understand. She asked curiously, of course they want to cultivate their own power in the future. Fan Xian smiled and continued to ask, then His Majesty will have to ask, why do you want to cultivate your own power? The Great Prince is someone who leads an army. What does he need such a large power in the court? Wan smiled bitterly and said, what about the Crown Prince? He is the heir to the throne of a country. Cultivating talents is acceptable. After all, he is going to be the emperor who will control the country in the future. In the past, when I listened to the Grand Tutor's lectures in the Eastern Palace, the Grand Tutor once said that the Eastern Palace cannot do nothing. He must not be afraid of rumors. He must first prepare some officials for future use. This is true loyalty and filial piety. Fan Xian shook his head and revealed a faint sneer. He said, the Grand Tutor's essay is probably good, and his reasoning is certainly correct. But the problem is that His Majesty is healthy. The Eastern Palace is now beginning to cultivate talents. His Majesty must ask himself, is the Crown Prince anxious? Chapter 167. Wan sucked in a breath of cold air. She realized that this was indeed the case. She heard Fan Xian continue with a smile. That is why His Majesty can endure it for a while, but he cannot endure it forever. He can endure the officials, but he cannot endure his own son. If His Majesty does not want to think about it, then so be it. But once he starts thinking about the first problem, he cannot help but suspect many things. So it is only natural that he will clean up the exam hall scandal. Lin Wanner leaned her head against his chest. Actually, these things are simple. If I want to think about it, I can understand it. Why can't the Crown Prince and the others understand? It's not that they don't understand. It's just that the Crown Prince has begun to feel insecure. Fan Xian thought of the gifts the Emperor had given to the three princes at the beginning of the year. The deeper meaning contained within was something even Fan Xian could not understand. Presumably, regardless of whether it was the Crown Prince or the Great Prince, they were both frightened and uneasy. That was why they had stretched their hands so far on the exam field. Lin Wanner sighed. I do not wish for you to become a king. I only wish to be a free and unfettered marquis. These things are always troublesome. To be rich and idle is my wish, Fan Xian replied with a smile. Thinking of Jia Baoyu's nickname, he continued, it's just that there are some things I can't get used to, and there will always be some suspicion. Who told me and my father to have such bad names? Seeing him tease her father, Lin Wanner could not help but laugh. She paused and asked, Father should be fine, right? Don't worry. Father went to the Prime Minister's manor that night. He shook his head and sighed in admiration. That's why I said that the Overwatch Council has handled this matter beautifully. Look at the officials who have been caught recently. Other than Minister Guo, there are people in the Eastern Palace and the Bureau of Military Affairs who have all fallen from their horses. Although my father-in-law has lost a right assistant minister, he hasn't been hurt to the core. This sense of propriety, if it wasn't done by an old hand who has been immersed in officialdom for decades, couldn't have been mastered to such perfection. Is it difficult? Lin Wanner asked with a smile. Fan Xian ran his fingers through his wife's black hair. Very difficult. You have to hurt those powers, but not let them die of pain. Otherwise, the emperor will not be able to handle it. After saying this, a faint look of worry appeared on his face. What's wrong? The attentive Wan hugged her husband's arm tightly and asked with concern. Fan Xian shook his head, trying to get rid of that hidden worry in his heart. I had originally thought that this scandal would not be able to be hidden from the world, so I was prepared to fight a hard battle. I didn't expect the Overwatch Council to cover me so well. But you're right. There are no concrete walls in this world. The Eastern Palace will eventually find out about my relationship with the Overwatch Council. Furthermore, there are too many madmen in the Qing Kingdom. Right now, I am worried about that crippled madman. Chen Pingping? Lin Wanner immediately knew who he was talking about, but she didn't know what connection her husband had with the Overwatch Council other than exposing the fraud. So she had some doubts. Her doubts were so strong that they overshadowed the words, cement wall. Fan Xian smiled and did not explain the matter completely. He only quietly said, I'm worried that Chen Pingping never wanted to hide this matter from the beginning. How dare he? Every girl liked their husband to be a hero filled with a sense of justice. So when Fan Xian secretly exposed the fraud, although Lin Wanner was worried, her heart was filled with satisfaction and pride. Hearing that Chen Pingping wanted to push her husband to the world, she thought of the danger and trembled. She snorted and said, tomorrow, I will go to the palace to find the Empress Dowager. Fan Xian laughed and comforted her. Even if Chen Pingping is pushing me out, I'm afraid he doesn't have any bad intentions. Lin Wanner did not understand, but Fan Xian knew that this was a good opportunity. After the banquet, if he wanted to firmly establish his reputation among the people of the Qing Kingdom, this scandal was undoubtedly the best opportunity. According to what Fei Jie had said, since his mother's close comrade, Chen Pingping, had always been unwilling to let him be a rich man in the palace treasury and insisted on letting him take charge of the Overwatch Council, then, according to Chen Pingping's legendary personality, it was not impossible for him to use the scandal to suddenly jump out of the crowd. The problem was, what was the ratio of gain to loss? Fan Xian was still a bit uncertain. He climbed out of bed and looked out the window at the light rain. Only then did he realize that it was almost noon. He and his wife had been in bed for most of the day. He couldn't help but smile sweetly, but his smile was a bit tired. This time, he exposed the fraud case, first, because he really pitied those truly talented scholars, second, because he was angry that those princes were using him as a rope, and most importantly, because he wanted to test Chen Pingping one last time. Fan Xian was going to Northern Qi, so he had to know what attitude that terrifyingly powerful old man of the Overwatch Council had toward him. At the same time, he wanted to see clearly what attitude the emperor behind the old man had toward him. Attitude determined everything. Attitude determined relationships. Attitude could reveal history. It could reveal one's past. Fan Xian slightly narrowed his eyes. Through the glass window that had been branded with his mother's scent, he looked at the dark clouds in the sky. He felt that everything in the Qing Kingdom was like an interesting brain teaser, and he seemed to be walking on a path that was infinitely close to the truth. Perhaps his goal was already very close. Outside Fan Manor, on the slightly damp street, an unmarked carriage was quietly waiting. Suddenly, a figure floated out from inside like a falling leaf. Just as he was about to land, his right hand rested on the edge of the carriage, and his whole body was already inside. Let's go, Fan Xian said as soon as he sat down. Teng Zijing looked back at the young master from the driver's seat and smiled bitterly. Young master, if the old master knew you were going out at this time of the year, he would teach me a lesson. Fan Xian's smile became even more bitter. If we don't hurry, not only will the old master use a stick to beat this unfilial son of mine, but even that gentle mistress of yours will use a rope to tie me up." At this time of year, everyone in the capital was in a state of panic. The news that Guoyu, the director of the Board of Rights, had been arrested and imprisoned had spread throughout the capital in just 2 hours. All the officials involved in the spring examination were restless and stayed at home, afraid that a spy from the Overwatch Council would knock on their door and politely invite them to tea. And Fan Xian was a key figure in the fraud case. Count Sinan, Fan Jian, and Princess Qin, who knew the inside story, did not dare to let him act. So he had to sneak out and sigh. "Teng Zijing, it's fortunate that I have you as a confidant in the capital. Otherwise, it would be difficult for me to even go out." Wang Qinian, who had been sitting quietly by his side, clearly had the most bitter smile on his face. "Sir, I have always wanted to work hard to become your confidant." Fan Xian laughed and teased him. "Wang Qinian, you should go do crosstalk." The whip cracked, and the black carriage slowly moved forward. The wheels rolled over the puddles of water on the street. The green trees around them were washed by the rain, appearing even more green and tender. Behind the carriage were a few secret agents of the Overwatch Council wearing raincoats. They followed the carriage from a distance. They were all from the Qinian unit, responsible for Commissioner Fan's safety. What if there are officials in the court seeking revenge? I don't have enough people here. Wang Qinian knew what Fan Xian had done with the council, and was a little worried. Fan Xian smiled, and a chill appeared in his eyes. "Things are different now, and the place we are going to is not Nyolan Street. I want to see, other than that crazy woman, who else would dare to assassinate me in the capital, right under His Majesty's nose?" "Where are we going?" Teng Zijing asked in a low voice, not turning his head. Fan Xian looked at Wang Qinian, and Wang Qinian whispered a name, then explained. "Coincidentally, the students you have taken a liking to are all staying in the same inn." The carriage stopped outside Diei Alley. It was still drizzling. After Fan Xian alighted, he and Teng Zijing walked in, paper umbrellas in hand. Wang Qinian had long since disappeared into the crowd. Diei Alley was a place where scholars from other counties gathered in the capital. Today, the exam hall fraud case had broken out in the capital, so it was still a cauldron of voices. Fan Xian raised his umbrella and carefully walked along the street, leaning slightly outward to prevent the rain from falling into the pots of the hawkers sheltering under the eaves of the street. "Excuse me, excuse me." A thin scholar hurriedly shouted, carrying 2 jugs of wine in his hands. He brushed past Fan Xian and Teng Zijing, rushing forward, unafraid of the rain falling from the sky. But as he passed, he turned his head to look at Fan Xian. Fan Xian raised his umbrella and watched the man disappear into the rain. He shook his head and laughed. "Isn't this just like the bunch of crazy people who graduated? Once the exam was over, they would get drunk." He smacked his lips, a little regretful that he hadn't been able to attend the school's graduation banquet because of his health. Teng Zijing didn't quite understand, but he still explained respectfully. "I guess it's because of Guoyu's downfall that these students are so excited. Is Minister Guo's reputation that bad?" Fan Xian casually walked forward, looking like a young master who liked to take a stroll in the rain. Teng Zijing laughed. "Not many of the capital's officials have a good reputation. There's a saying in the village, if you line up the officials of the 6 ministries and behead them, it's likely that one of them will be innocent." Fan Xian laughed. In his previous life, there was also a joke like this. "Then do you think my father was the one who was innocent?" Everyone knew that Count Sinan had been an assistant minister in the Ministry of Revenue and later a minister. Who knew how much money he had taken from the national treasury? In terms of corrupt officials, Fan Xian's father and father-in-law would probably be in the top 3. But Teng Zijing didn't dare say this. Hearing the young master's question, cold sweat began to drip down his back. He smiled bitterly. "Young master, I misspoke. Please don't take it to heart. What are corrupt officials afraid of? The world doesn't worry about corrupt officials, but they worry about corrupt and incompetent officials. Young master, your words are inappropriate. Suddenly, someone unceremoniously squeezed into Fan Xian's umbrella to shelter from the rain. In his hand was a paper-wrapped roast chicken. The slightly charred aroma of the roast chicken couldn't be drowned out by the rain. Chapter 168. The rain continued to fall. The umbrellas among the pedestrians in the alley were like a few pitiful flowers blooming. Fan Xian smiled slightly and glanced at this impetuous young man. He found that the other party was already drenched, so he didn't say anything. If the other party really was a bad person, in that instant, Fan Xian had at least 5 ways to immediately incapacitate the other party. Clearly, he was just a poor scholar buying roast chicken to make up for the banquet. Fan Xian didn't stop. He raised his umbrella and walked forward. He walked confidently, and the young man who had squeezed into the umbrella also walked confidently. Without a word, he stood to Fan Xian's right and used his cloth umbrella to block the sky above his head. His demeanor was calm as he followed. Like this, they walked dozens of steps under the umbrella. Fan Xian increasingly felt that the young man's temperament was rather cute. If he was a normal scholar, he wouldn't have so rashly squeezed under someone else's umbrella. Furthermore, he walked silently for dozens of steps without a trace of discomfort. So he tilted his head slightly and carefully looked him over. He found that the young man's appearance was rather ordinary. However, his eyebrows were very thick. It was as if someone had used a brush to paint them thickly. Teng Zijing followed 2 steps behind. The 2 people under the umbrella continued to walk silently. It was unclear whether they were competing in patience or something else. In the end, it was Fan Xian who smiled and asked, "I said earlier that it was inappropriate." What was inappropriate? Seeing that the owner of the umbrella had spoken, the young scholar smiled politely and said, "If an official is corrupt, he naturally won't put his mind on political affairs. If you want a corrupt official to be capable, I'm afraid this in itself is a very laughable matter." Fan Xian smiled and found that the umbrella could not hold the 2 of them. The young scholar's right shoulder was already wet. So he quietly shifted the umbrella over to the other side and replied, "Even if a corrupt official is negligent in political affairs, it is still better than someone who doesn't know anything and blindly messes around after becoming an official." The young scholar raised his eyebrows as if he didn't understand. As long as he is willing to work, it is better than neglecting political affairs. Fan Xian's hand tightened around the umbrella handle. He shook his head and said, "If a river dike is not repaired, it will probably break every few years. If an honest official who doesn't know how to work the river works blindly repairs the dikes, perhaps there will be a few quarrels every year. Do you think the commoners living along the river hope that the county is an incompetent and diligent official, or an incompetent and lazy corrupt official?" The young scholar was momentarily at a loss for words. After a long while, he chuckled and said, "I'm afraid this is also a special case. There are always some things that a government official must do, such as measuring the fields and distributing grain, providing disaster relief to the people, and adjudicating cases and prisons. If he is a lazy official, I'm afraid that his administration will also be in a mess." Fan Xian smiled and said, "So, the key lies in ability, not purity or greed." Actually, this view of his was not necessarily correct. It could be said that he had been influenced by the official novels of his previous life. But this kind of argument was quite fresh among the people of the kingdom of Qing. The young scholar who shared the umbrella with him couldn't help but be interested. He asked, "If an official has ability but is extremely corrupt, does the court just let him be?" For some reason, when Fan Xian heard this, he thought of his own father-in-law, the famous evil prime minister of the kingdom of Qing, Lin Ruofu. Everyone knew of his greed, but His Majesty knew of his ability, and so he continued to use him. Thinking of the young scholar's question again, he could only shake his head and say, "Governing officials is a difficult and complicated matter. There is no simple and effective way. But if we only ask for the court's supervision and self-cultivation, then we can extravagantly hope that the officialdom will be clean and tidy. If the court strengthens its supervision, can't it prevent corruption?" The young scholar frowned, his thick eyebrows squeezed together like rafters. "Let's say that Guoyu, the Minister of Rights, has already been imprisoned. If the Overwatch Council had been like this a few years ago, the atmosphere in the exam hall would have been corrupted to what it is today." Fan Xian actually didn't have much of an opinion on politics, but deep in his bones he was not afraid of harming the country. His interest was piqued, and he continued, "If Director Chen of the Overwatch Council bribed Guoyu and allowed his nephew to be recorded as a first-class official, then who do you think will supervise this matter?" The young scholar didn't think much of it. "Of course there will be His Majesty, who is as sharp as lightning." Fan Xian was even more unconvinced. How could it be so easy for one person to rule the world? In fact, he knew that the emperor must have some secret means to keep the Overwatch Council in check and balance. These means might even include the power that his father had never revealed. But some of the inexperienced political ideas of his previous life made Fan Xian scoff at the emperor's work. He never thought that the emperor, who saw the world as a juicy piece of meat in a bowl, would have the spirit to care about all the injustices in the officialdom. Casually talking, the two under the umbrella arrived outside an inn. The young scholar smiled warmly. "Thank you for your gift, master. I have arrived." Fan Xian tilted the umbrella to one side and glanced at the name of the inn. Coincidentally, it was also the place he was looking for. He smiled. "I'll go in with you. I'm going to the inn to find someone." The name of the inn was very common, but also very common, Tongfu Inn. When he entered the inn with the young scholar, he learned that his name was Shi Chanli, who was also an examinee entering the capital. But it was not convenient for Fan Xian to say his name, so he only told the other that his surname was Fan. "Who are you looking for, Master Fan?" Only now did Shi Chanli realize from the young man's clothing that he must be the son of an influential family. His words were not as unrestrained as they had been under the umbrella, but more reserved. "I'm here to visit a friend. It's not convenient for us to talk. If fate wills it, we will meet again." Having said this, he bowed to Fan Xian and walked to the corner of the inn's front hall. There was a wine table there. Next to the table were two people who looked like students competing with each other. Next to them was someone who was already drunk and unconscious, sleeping on the table. Seeing that there were no dishes on the table, it seemed that they were waiting for Shi Chanli's roast chicken. Fan Xian squinted and saw that the drunk person at the table was Yang Wanli, whom he had come to visit. He smiled and followed Shi Chanli to the table. Shi Chanli didn't know that Fan Xian was still behind him. He put the roast chicken, wrapped in oil paper, on the table and laughed at the two people who had stopped competing. "Hoji Chang," he said, "you called me to bring food, but you didn't leave me some wine." Hoji Chang smiled and said, "This wine of mine is a low-quality wine that I bought from the alley earlier. Although the taste is not good, the quantity is sufficient. Let me introduce you, this is the scholar from Shandong Road, Cheng Jialan." Just as he reached out his hand in Cheng Jialan's direction, he was surprised to find a smiling, handsome young man standing behind Shi Chanli. This young man looked somewhat familiar. "Brother Shi, who is this?" Hoji Chang asked. Shi Chanli was startled. He turned his head to find that Fan Xian had followed him to the wine table. "Master Fan," he said with a wry smile, "I only borrowed half an umbrella. There's no need to charge me for shelter from the rain." Fan Xian could see that Shi Chanli was somewhat afraid of him. He guessed that Fan Xian was from a rich family and didn't dare to get too close to him. So he smiled and said, I wouldn't dare charge you. I'm just a bit hungry for the roast chicken you brought. Xiaofan said helplessly, Master Fan, aren't you looking for someone? You can wear out iron shoes in fruitless search, but by chance you'll find it without any effort. Fan Xian smiled. When he first met Sheng Yan on the banks of the Lujing River, he had said these words, but there had been no reaction. But today, he used it on these scholars, and sure enough, Ho Jichang and the others immediately understood what he meant. They were very interested and asked, Master Fan, are you looking for us? Fan Xian pointed at the drunk Yang Wanli and said, Master Yang and I are old friends, so I've come to pay a visit. Ho Jichang laughed. I've never heard of Wanli having such a generous friend in the capital. Come, Master Fan, please sit. Here is some wine and roast chicken. I'm glad you don't mind. Xiaofan had always liked Fan Xian's way of talking, and seeing that he was a friend of a friend, he didn't put on airs and offered his seat. On the other side, Cheng Jialan had been trying to wake Yang Wanli up, and he couldn't help but smile at Fan Xian. Fan Xian was curious about something else. He cupped his hands and bowed to Ho Jichang. How should I address you, brother? Ho Jichang. Master Ho, why are you so sure that I'm a generous young master? Hearing the name Jichang, Fan Xian couldn't help but want to laugh. I don't think I'm born fat, he said. One look and you can tell that I'm a person who eats his fill and has nothing better to do. Ho Jichang smiled and apologized, saying, Gongzi's clothes are worth a lot of money, how can an ordinary scholar afford to wear it? As for the word, generous, it's just that we're used to it. I hope you don't mind. He felt that this young man looked familiar, but his vision was a bit blurry from the alcohol, so he couldn't remember. Not at all, not at all. Fan Xian smiled warmly and sat down at the table. Scholars were free and easy, and they didn't care too much about an uninvited guest. Yang Wanli wouldn't wake up for a while anyway, so other than Cheng Jialan, who urged Fan Xian to drink a few cups, Ho Jichang and Xiaofan began to compete with each other as if no one else was present. Before they'd had enough, they began to discuss the Tao again. This was not the mysterious Tao, but the Tao of a country's economy and people's livelihood. Fan Xian picked up a chicken leg and slowly nibbled on it while listening to the two debate. He found that Ho Jichang's way of thinking leaned towards the school of legalism. He placed great emphasis on the law, while Xiaofan was a sentimental person who placed great emphasis on education. But in the end, the one leaning towards the school of legalism wasn't blindly demanding, and the one who placed great emphasis on education wasn't blindly admonishing. They really were two very clear-eyed scholars. Occasionally, when he talked about the political affairs of the various counties, he would analyze them carefully and not just talk about them in general. He was not like other scholars who always focused on the word world, but he did not know that the word world was much broader than the eyes of the vast majority of people in the world. The more Fan Xian listened, the more pleased he became. Ho Jichang's name was one of the names he'd written down. It seemed that he had a good eye. But this Xiaofan temperament was warm and easy. How come he had no impression of him in the exam hall? As he was feeling pleased with himself, he suddenly heard the gentle Xiaofan slam the table and angrily say, in the end, it's all that Sir Fan Jr.'s fault. Fan Xian couldn't help but be surprised. Chapter 169. As it turned out, the conversation at the table had shifted from officialdom to literature. Naturally, it was inevitable that they would talk about Sir Fan, who had shocked the world with his poetry last year. Fan Xian pretended to hold the wine cup and sip it, but he was prepared. If this guy dared to say one bad word about him, he would throw the cup of wine in his hand out to relieve his anger. Unexpectedly, Xiaofan stood up. His face was flushed like a peach blossom, and he began to recite mushy words. Tears streamed down his face as he said, I've been reading the Banxian's High Poetry Anthology for months. How can I read other people's poems? How can I have the courage to pick up my brush and write again? Although there are a few poems that I find strange, with Sir Fan before me, how can I be a little sure? How sad, how sad. Fan Xian beamed, thinking of those lovely people who criticized their leaders for not taking care of their rest. Ho Ji-chang, however, said disapprovingly, poetry is outside the realm. What can it do to govern the country? Having said this, he turned to Fan Xian, who had been cold all day, and asked for help. What do you think, Sir Fan? He couldn't help but look at Fan Xian again. Oh, it's you. Fan Xian was shocked again. Had he been recognized? The lighting in the exam hall was not very bright. Aside from people like Yang Wanli, who dared to look him in the eye and talk to him with his eyes, not many people dared to look at the examiner's face. Ho Ji-chang's next words came very quickly. Earlier, when I was buying wine, I brushed shoulders with Sir Fan. Fan Xian immediately remembered that this was the scholar who had carried the 2 pots of wine. For some reason, such a small matter made Ho Ji-chang seem much more friendly toward Fan Xian, and he began to speak enthusiastically. Not only did Fan Xian find it strange, even Shi Chanli was a little confused. Sir Fan and Sir Fan are of the same school. Why don't you tell us what you think of Sir Fan's Banxian's High Poetry Anthology? I'm just borrowing from others. No matter how thick-skinned Fan Xian was, he couldn't bring himself to praise himself in front of others. Who knew that Shi Chanli would become angry when he heard this? He put down his chopsticks and said, "Is Sir Fan the same as Master Zhuang? I thought highly of Zhuang Mohan's character, but I didn't expect him to be such a muddle-headed scoundrel. Master Fan, if you're less educated, you shouldn't say such ridiculous things." Fan Xian was startled. Only now did he realize that he had long since established an unbreakable position in the hearts of the kingdom of Qing scholars. He smiled shyly, not knowing what to say. Seeing that Fan Xian was speechless, Shi Chanli became tipsy and jokingly scolded, "You are both young masters of the Fan family. How can there be such a big gap between you?" At this moment, Yang Wanli finally woke up under Cheng Jialan's care. The first thing he saw was Fan Xian's beautiful face. He was quite frightened. He quickly stood up and bowed to Fan Xian. "Sir Fan, why are you here?" "Master Fan? Which Master Fan?" The other 3 men at the table were confused. They didn't know why Yang Wanli was so nervous. Yang Wanli smiled bitterly. "This is the person I mentioned earlier, Sir Fan Jr., who let the students into the examination hall. Brother Shi, don't you like Banxian's high poems the most? Hurry up and pay your respects." Only now did Shi Chanli realize that the person he had just scolded was Fan Xian himself. The intense shock made him jump up from his chair. He didn't know whether to bow to Fan Xian or not. He looked very awkward. Even Ho Ji-chang and Cheng Shilin, who were much calmer, had their mouths wide open. They looked at Fan Xian, not knowing what to say. Fan Xian had long since become a first-class figure in the hearts of the world's scholars. Later, he married the Prime Minister's daughter and became a 5th-level scholar at the Imperial College at the age of 17. No matter how one looked at it, he was the object of the scholars' envy. And his Banxian's high poems had long since become popular. The image of the red light floating above the clouds had become one with the name Fan Xian. Fan Xian smiled a little embarrassedly. "What? So surprised to see a living person?" Ho Ji-chang was the first to wake up. He smiled bitterly. "So you are Sir Fan Jr. I apologize for my lack of manners earlier." Shi Chanli's eyes shone. He bowed deeply to Fan Xian and said sincerely, "Thanks to Brother Yang, I was actually able to meet Sir Fan Jr. today. It is truly a great fortune." Fan Xian shook his head and smiled. "The examination is over. I don't want to stay in the manor forever, so I came out for a walk. I knew that Yang Wanli was staying in this inn, so I came to find him. I didn't expect my luck to be so good. Earlier at the table, I listened to your wise words. It was not a wasted trip. The crowd couldn't help but feel ashamed. They thought back to how they had talked and talked in front of this great scholar. Now that they thought about it, it was indeed a little absurd. Even the proud Ho Jichang smiled bitterly. It's all Wanli's fault. He was drunk all along. At that moment, Cheng Shilin, who had been speaking slowly, finally introduced himself. Sir Fan, my surname is Cheng. Cheng Shilin. Thinking that he might be able to form a relationship with this popular figure of the court, Cheng Shilin, the scholar of Shandong Road, felt inexplicably nervous. He stuttered. Everyone was startled. Soon after, they heard the mistake in his words. They couldn't help but burst into laughter. Cheng Shilin's face also reddened. He mumbled, not knowing what to say. Fortunately, his laughter diluted some of the shock in everyone's hearts. Hearing that Sir Fan Jr. had come to find him, Yang Wanli couldn't help but feel a little puzzled and flattered. What orders do you have, Sir Fan Jr.? Fortunately, these people all knew what they were doing, and most of them still had the selfish thought of putting the treasure on their table. So they didn't make a ruckus. The students inside and outside the inn continued to drink and make merry. No one knew that Sir Fan Jr., who was often mentioned, was in the inn at that moment. Otherwise, there would have been a great deal of noise and excitement. Fan Xian had originally just wanted to give Yang Wanli a hint, but he hadn't expected such a situation. Naturally, it wasn't appropriate to talk about it. He smiled and said, no matter what, Brother Yang and I are fated to share a robe. He turned to Shi Chanli and said, Brother Yang and I are fated to share a robe. He then turned to Ho Jichang and said, Brother Ho and I are fated to meet, so there are some things I would like to remind you all. As soon as these words came out, even Cheng Shilin, who had not been named, became nervous. Ho Jichang could no longer maintain his calm expression. Every scholar wanted a good future, and this Sir Fan Jr. was the censor of this year's civil service examination. Now that he had come here without avoiding suspicion, what he had to say was naturally very important. Fan Xian paused and considered his words. The court examinations will be held on the 1st of March. You should all make some preparations. The students were shocked, and their hands, hidden in their sleeves, could not help but tremble. These words seemed ordinary, but the hidden meaning was shocking. Sir Fan Jr. was a popular figure in the court, and behind him was the Prime Minister, Count Sinan. If anyone could know the list of the top 3 ahead of time, Fan Xian certainly had the right to do so. Since he had asked everyone to prepare for the palace examination, that meant, they would definitely make the list. Fan Xian put a finger to his lips and made a gesture for silence. He smiled and said, not necessarily. I'm just here to remind you all. Ho Jichang said absent-mindedly, Minister Guo has been arrested and imprisoned. The list will certainly change. Fan Xian quietly replied, I don't remember Brother Cheng and Brother Shi, but Brother Ho and Brother Yang will definitely make it. Ho and Yang were overjoyed. No longer boasting, they stood up and bowed deeply to Fan Xian. They knew that from now on, the two of them were definitely going to worship this young teacher, unless they did not want to have a broad official career and a prosperous future. Cheng Shilin and Shi Chanli were slightly disappointed, but they thought that Sir Fan Jr. just didn't remember clearly, and that there would not be a good result tomorrow. They comforted themselves. It was clear that the inn was no longer a suitable place to talk. Yang Wanli respectfully invited Fan Xian into his room and then served him good tea. After a while, he sincerely said, Sir Fan Jr., I have no money, no power, no mouth, and no face. I really do not know how I could gain your favor, and I do not know why you would take the risk to come and tell me this news. The words, no money, no power, no reputation, and no reputation really spoke of the bitterness and powerlessness of those without connections. Fan Xian smiled and shook his head. You all know the state of the examination field of Qing. Although the list of the top 3 has not yet come out, it has generally been decided. As for why I have come today, it is because I am afraid that you will give up on yourself. You will not review your studies, and you will not respond. If you lose face in the palace, I am afraid that my face will not be good either. You must know that outside the exam hall, many people saw me let you in. I might as well say that I have taken a small risk, but it does not matter. Today, the examiners in the capital were all frightened and uneasy, but Fan Xian said it did not matter. The students could not help but be surprised. Now that things had come to this, these clever people naturally understood the meaning of Fan Xian's visit. They looked at each other, and Ho Ji-chang bowed first. Thank you, teacher. Yang Wanli bowed again. Even Shi Chanli and Cheng Shilin were no longer sitting, and bowed to Fan Xian. Fan Xian looked at the 4 scholars who were a few years older than him, and he could not help but feel a little strange. He smiled. I am not the father-in-law of the Prime Minister's manor, and I am not Minister Gua. Besides, I have money, and I will have even more money in the future, so you do not need to worry. I only value your talent and virtue. As for after the palace examination, you will enter the court as officials. As long as you are loyal, diligent, and work for the benefit of the country, I am sure that I have not misjudged you. Naturally, I will be happy. These words were very gentle, but they were very cold. The 4 were shocked, and they agreed sincerely. After chatting for a while, Fan Xian found out that the reason he Zhongwei did not participate in the spring examination was because of the death of an elder in his family. He sighed a few times, and then took his leave. After leaving and getting into the carriage, Fan Xian frowned and said to Teng Zijing, why am I still not used to doing this? Wang Qinian appeared in the carriage at the right time, and replied softly, because deep down, you are still a scholar, not an adult. Chapter 170. After Fan Xian left the Tongfu Tavern, the 4 scholars in the room looked at each other. It seemed that they had never imagined that such a big piece of cake would fall from the sky and fall on their heads. What do we do now? Yang Wanli sat on the bed, somewhat stupefied. After Cheng Jialin and Shi Chanli congratulated him, they laughed. From now on, Brother Yang, you have the support of the Prime Minister and the Minister of Revenue. I'm afraid your career will be smooth sailing. Yang Wanli's simple and honest face showed a hint of bitterness. I have always admired Sir Fan's talent and learning. This spring examination was also thanks to him making an exception. I presume that Sir Fan also put in a lot of effort to mark the papers behind the scenes. Only, I wish that Sir Fan had not made this trip today. Cheng and Shi were speechless. They knew that Yang Wanli felt that Fan Xian had done him a favor. Ho Ji-chang, who had always been the hidden leader of the group, smiled and shook his head. If Sir Fan had done him a favor, he would not have come in person. Wanli, you worry too much. I have decided that from now on, in the court, I will think of Sir Fan as my idol. I will make a name for myself. Shi Chanli was stunned. Why had Ho Ji-chang, who had always prided himself on being virtuous, suddenly changed his temperament? Yang Wanli shook his head and said, I also know that in every exam, teachers and students are the norm. But as you know, Brother Ho, I have always respected Sir Fan Jr.'s talent and learning. Because of the item I carried on my person, and because I like Sir Fan Jr.'s personality, I always hoped that Sir Fan Jr. would be different from these court officials. I've asked for perfection, I've asked for perfection. Cheng Jialin scolded him. Although Sir Fan has the talent of poetry, he is still an official of the court and the son of a noble. It is not easy for him to come here in person. Brother Wanli, Do you hope that Sir Fan is a true immortal who does not eat the food of common mortals? Besides, a true immortal is not necessarily better for this impoverished mortal world than a capable official who is good at scheming. Shi Chanli clapped his hands in praise. Brother Jialin, although you are a man of few words, your words today are very clear. He turned to Yang Wanli and said, if we are talking about admiration, Wanli, you definitely cannot compare to me. I often hold the Bangxian's High Poetry Anthology in my hands and can recite the hundreds of poems inside like the back of my hand. However, seeing Sir Fan Jr. today, I am not at all disappointed. Why? It is all because poetry speaks from the heart. Sir Fan Jr. is indeed a free and easy person of my generation. How can he be compared to those corrupt officials in court? He smiled and continued, when I brought the roast chicken here earlier, there weren't many people holding umbrellas in the alley. I'm a person who likes to play around. Looking at the young man under the umbrella, his face was delicate and pretty, his breath was fresh and pleasant, and his comments were somewhat novel and frightening. Therefore, I recklessly crawled under his umbrella and walked all the way here. If it was any other powerful official, how could they tolerate my rudeness? Sir Fan Jr.'s face was full of smiles. Traveling with me, there was not a trace of unnaturalness in his expression. In the inn, I found out that he was Fan Xian. To tell the truth, I was pleasantly surprised. Fan Xian, you really didn't disappoint me. Only now did everyone realize that there had been such a thing. No wonder Fan Xian had said that he and Shi Chanli were fated. Thinking of the feeling, they couldn't help but smile. Yang Wanli scratched his head awkwardly. Maybe. I just feel a sense of nirvanic disillusionment. I've always felt that Sir Fan Jr. should be the kind of person who sits idle on a grape rack, writes thousands of poems, and doesn't care about the filthy matters of the court. Ho Jichang shook his head in disapproval. That kind of person seems elegant and refined, but he's really useless to the country, and of no benefit to the people. If Sir Fan really was like that, I would actually look down on him. Not necessarily. Yang Wanli sighed. Ho Jichang smiled lightly. I'm not afraid of being laughed at, but how can a scholar serve his country? The only way is to enter the court and become an official. But how can outsiders like you and I understand the mysteries and terrors of the court? So, Sir Fan Jr. came today not because he needs us, but because he knows that we need him. He paused, then continued, although I have some pride, I'm not a pedantic person who doesn't know when to advance or retreat. Since we have this opportunity, of course we must seize it. If we must follow someone in the court, then I think that Sir Fan is the best choice. I think that in the future, his achievements in the court will not conflict with our daily ideals. Everyone asked in unison, why? Everyone was a little puzzled by Ho Jichang's resolute attitude. Hearing him emphasize it now, they became even more curious. Ho Jichang picked up his teacup from the table and looked at the remnants of Fan Xian's tea. He was a little lost in thought. After a while, he said, a popular person of the court on a rainy day would actually take care that the water on his umbrella wouldn't drip into the pot of a street vendor sheltering from the rain. He would rather get himself wet than lean to the side. Such a considerate and kind person, if he isn't a great villain, then he's a great sage. He smiled. A 17-year-old youth can't hide it so well at any time, so I believe that Sir Fan Jr. is a great sage. My judgment is that simple, because I was moved by that scene in the rain. The room was silent. After a long time, there was a sigh. The next day, on the red wall to the left of the exam hall, the yellow paper that the examinees had been waiting for was finally pasted. The rules for selecting scholars in the Kingdom of Qing spring examination were not complicated. After the provincial examination was the general examination, and after the general examination, the top 3 candidates would be chosen. However, there was no ranking, and they were arranged according to the strokes on the imperial list. The number of people in the top 3 varied from year to year. Because there had been an additional examination in the 3rd year of the Qing calendar, the number of candidates in the next 2 years was a little low. This year, there were only 108 names on the imperial list. Because there were so few candidates, whether it was the students of the Imperial College in the capital or the scholars from various counties who had come to the capital to take the exam, they were all nervous and uneasy. To the west of the examination hall was a bridge. If one wanted to look at the results under the Vermilion Wall, they had to cross the bridge. At this time, the area under the Vermilion Wall was already surrounded by students wearing long gowns. The crowd was moving, and they were nervously searching for their names on the big yellow paper. On the other side of the bridge, Ho Jichang and Yang Wanli, who had already taken the medicine to calm their hearts, walked slowly. The bridge was still stained with yesterday's rain, and the moss between the bricks was particularly slippery. The 4 of them walked that way, and Cheng Jialin almost slipped, which made the crowd laugh. Cheng Jialin laughed at himself. Although his and Shi Chanli's steps were as slow as his 2 friends, they couldn't help but be nervous deep down. Coming to the red wall, the 4 of them squeezed through the crowd with great difficulty. They began to look from the left side, and after who knew how long, they suddenly heard Shi Chanli cry out in joy. "Brother Ho, Brother Ho! Got it! Got it!" The other 3 heard the sound and hurried to Shi Chanli's side. Sure enough, they saw Ho Jichang's name on the 3rd row above their heads. They couldn't help but feel excited. Yang Wanli lightly punched Ho Jichang's shoulder, his face full of smiles. Ho Jichang smiled slightly, wanting to show a trace of pride, but this was a big deal. Although he considered himself virtuous, thinking of the 10 years of hardship he had suffered, the ardent expectations of his parents at home, and the envious gazes of the scholars around him, he couldn't help but feel a little smug. He couldn't help but open his mouth, revealing an extremely happy smile. At this time, the 3 golden words, Ho Jichang, on the imperial list seemed to shine in the sunlight, appearing incomparably precious and with a limitless future. The 4 of them no longer separated and simply looked carefully to the right. After who knew how long, they finally succeeded in finding Yang Wanli's name on the imperial list. Only now did they truly believe what Xiaofan Jr. had said the day before. Yang Wanli saw that his name was indeed on the imperial list, and he was extremely excited. His eyes were a little red, and he mumbled to himself, "I really got it, I really got it." He suddenly let out a strange cry and rushed out of the crowd. He ran to the side of the bridge and roared at the water below. His voice reverberated through the bridge, making a buzzing sound. The 3 friends looked at him with smiles, knowing why he was so excited. Yang Wanli lost his mother when he was 8, and grew up alone in Quanzhou. It was all thanks to his father, who endured the cold and hunger to buy him a lot of books and urged him to enter the family school. He endured the supercilious look and studied, and with great difficulty, passed the provincial exams and came to the capital. But after a month in the capital, Yang Wanli discovered that he should have been talented, and that his reasoning was more practical than other scholars. Unfortunately, the He family mountain was far away, and the family school was simple and crude. He never learned the flourishing rhetoric of the scholars in the capital, and his essays were always dry and unattractive. So even his close friends, Ho Jichang and Shi Chanli, thought he couldn't get it. Yang Wanli himself didn't have much hope, so he spent the last of his silver to buy the most popular shirt among the students, and put Shi Chanli's essay in it. He wanted to gamble. He didn't expect that before he even entered the examination hall, he would be dragged out by the scholar Fan Xian. At the time, Yang Wanli was devastated. He had thought that his 10 years of hard work had been wasted, and he didn't expect that Xiaofan Jr. would give him a second chance. After the examination, he left the hospital and didn't dare to use the notes in his shirt. Naturally, the essays he wrote were not brilliant, and so he gave up on the idea of writing. He just drank and made merry. Only when he heard that Minister Gua had been imprisoned did he smile a little more. He didn't expect that Sir Fan Jr. would personally come to Tongfu Tavern to see him, and secretly mention that he might enter the top 3. After sorrow came joy, and after despair came hope. This kind of emotional impact continued until today. After Yang Wanli crossed the bridge and stood under the red wall, he increasingly felt that Sir Fan Jr.'s visit yesterday was a dream, and that he couldn't have gotten it. But, he really did get it. Yang Wanli looked at his slightly twisted face in the rippling water, and calmed down a little. Naturally, he understood why he had been so lucky in a few short days, and he was very grateful to that young man. Chapter 171. None of the scholars noticed Yang Wanli's deranged actions. Even the citizens of the capital who were passing by on the other side of the river did not look over curiously. Because in the capital, this kind of scene was all too common, especially when the results of the spring examinations were released. Near the vermilion wall of the examination hall, there would always be many madmen appearing out of nowhere. At this moment, the scholars on the other side of the bridge all had strange expressions on their faces. Some were excited, some were dejected. Those who had made it looked up to the sky and cried out, while those who had not made it hit the ground with their heads. There were all kinds of expressions, and it was indescribably comical. There were even more miserable scholars who wailed incessantly, hugging the large locust tree next to the vermilion wall and rubbing their faces against it. No matter how hard their companions pulled, they would not let go, until their cheeks were bleeding. They looked incomparably wretched. The kingdom of Qing used the imperial examinations to select scholars, and those who were not from high clans could not be granted any imperial examinations. So for ordinary commoner scholars, the release of the results of the spring examinations was the only way they could change their lives. This kind of pressure and motivation was enough to turn a gentle and refined scholar into a deranged madman. Compared to those scholars who were kneeling on the riverbank and praying to the heavens, thanking the heavens for allowing them to make it. Yang Wanli had only shouted twice, and it was indeed rather dull. Of course, this highlighted the steadiness of Ho Jichang and the other two. By the time Yang Wanli had regained his composure and was happily walking back to the vermilion wall, his 3 friends had already carefully examined the entire imperial proclamation. Unexpectedly, Shi Chanli had not made it onto the list. What made everyone disappointed and somewhat happy was that Cheng Jialan's name had shockingly appeared in the last row. Cheng Jialan's face was full of uncontrollable excitement, but seeing Shi Chanli's slightly disappointed expression, he could not show it too much. He comforted him, "If you don't make it this time, come back next year." This was a very old-fashioned comforting phrase, but under these circumstances, it seemed to be the only old-fashioned thing to say. Shi Chanli laughed bitterly. Looking at the despondent examinees around him who had failed, he forced himself to raise his spirits and smiled. "This time, 3 out of the 4 of us have made it, which is already a great thing. Compared to the previous year's spring examinations, this year's list is much fairer. As for me, I'll have to reconsider." Ho Jichang nodded and gently patted Shi Chanli on the shoulder. He knew that although Shi Chanli was the most carefree of the 4, the blow he had taken today was not small. He changed the subject and smiled. "I don't know how Sir Fan Jr. did it to protect so many people. I see that the rankings are different from previous years. There are more names with real talent, and there are fewer stupid and incompetent people who rely solely on their family background. It must have something to do with the Overwatch Council's investigation of the exam hall fraud." At this moment, the few of them had already walked to a quiet place by the riverbank and sat down. Their voices were still very soft, afraid that they would cause trouble for their fellow disciple, Master Xian. Ho Jichang shook his head. Although many officials were arrested this time, other than a few Jiangnan scholars, no other scholars were exposed. From this, it can be seen that before the Overwatch Council acted, Sir Fan Xian had already made arrangements. He shook his head with a bitter smile and sighed. He thought that young Sir Fan really did have a strong background, to be able to do something like this during the national ceremony. But it seemed that he had not misjudged Fan Xian. This year's list was much fairer. The four of them chatted about the situation in the capital. Over the past 2 days, there had been many officials who had fallen from grace. Everyone in the officialdom was in danger, but Fan Xian looked very confident. At this moment, Shi Chanli, who had been silent all this time, suddenly opened his mouth. I think that Sir Fan has something to do with the scandal being exposed. The other three were shocked. If that is true, then Sir Fan is even more amazing than we thought. Of course, Fan Xian had something to do with the scandal at the exam hall, but the Overwatch Council had acted appropriately. Although Guoyu, the director of the Board of Rights, had fallen, the Eastern Palace had not suffered too much damage. So for the time being, the Crown Prince was only suspicious of Fan Xian. And in this list, the Eastern Palace still had 3 people they needed. Compared to the Great Prince and the Bureau of Military Affairs, this was a very good result. Fan Xian sat in his study, looking at the list that Wang Qinian had copied out. He frowned slightly. The capital had not been peaceful for the past 2 days. The chief official Guoyu, a teacher, and a supervisor had all been invited to tea by the Overwatch Council. As for Fan Xian, as the examiner of the spring examination, he had been in charge of the crucial step of sealing the names, yet nothing had happened. It was inevitable that some people would begin to speculate. But he was also somewhat happy. Of the students he favored, aside from Shi Chanli, who had a personality that he liked the most had successfully entered the list. As for the results of the court examinations, that would depend on their luck. There was really nothing he could do to help. As he left the study, he saw a green silhouette walking toward him. Fan Xian let out a cry and prepared to hide in his room. He cried bitterly in his heart. Who would have thought that his father would come to his courtyard today? Count Sinan, Fan Jian, was now the official minister of revenue, but his stern face had not changed much. He coldly pushed open the door to his son's room, which had not been closed in time. He stepped in and sternly shouted, "You went out again yesterday?" Fan Xian smiled bitterly and bowed. "Father, it was raining in the capital last night, so I wanted to go for a walk." "How many people did you think you could hide your visit to Tongfu Tavern?" Fan Jian sat down. Lin Wanner, who was in a side room, heard the noise and rushed over. She hurriedly called for a maid to bring her master tea. Fan Jian looked at his daughter-in-law warmly and smiled. He waved his hand, indicating that she should go back to her room to rest. His expression was as cold as ice. The matters of the exam hall are complicated. You rashly did that, so be it. I asked you to stay in the mansion to avoid this storm. Yesterday, you went to the Tongfu Tavern to see those students. Today, when the imperial proclamation comes out, everyone can see clearly that those students are on the proclamation. How will the world see you? Fan Xian smiled. Although I am young, I am still a teacher. It is normal for me to go and see the examinees. As for the list, everyone knows what is going on. Why should I care? But recently, the Overwatch Council has been investigating a case of cheating, and the cause of this matter is the slip of paper you passed to them. Fan Jian coldly said, "Anji, if you are truly working for the country, then you should not have placed your own people in the top 3. If you only wanted to use the spring examinations to cultivate your own power, then you should not have turned against Guoyu and pulled him down." Count Sinan looked at his young son in front of him. After a long while, he sighed. No matter where you are, you have your own set of rules. The officialdom of the capital is even more so. Among officials, there are honest officials and corrupt officials. Among officials, there are slanderous officials and honest officials. These are two distinct paths. If you want to be an honest official, then do not walk the path of slanderous officials. Hearing his father call him by his courtesy name, Fan Xian knew that the old man was indeed angry. He gently replied, I do not want to be an honest official, nor do I want to be a slanderous official. I want to be a powerful official. As soon as he said this, the air in the study suddenly became so cold that it seemed to freeze. After a long while, Fan Jian softly said, a powerful official? What kind of official can be called a powerful official? He shook his head, and a strange smile appeared on his face. The Prime Minister has power, I have power, and Chen Pingping has power. But do you think that just because you're a subject, you can be called a powerful subject? Fan Xian calmly replied, I cannot, because the power lies in the hands of His Majesty. Then what kind of powerful official do you want to be? With power in my hands, there is nothing to worry about, Fan Xian replied sincerely. I want to be a powerful official that even the emperor's family cannot decide whether I live or die. Because I have the power to protect myself, but not others. So I need power. Fan Jian looked at his son, and there was a trace of worry in his eyes. Fan Xian smiled helplessly. The reason he had chosen this unusually dangerous and boring path was naturally because of the thick darkness in the depths of his heart. After a long while, a cold light shone in Fan Jian's eyes. In the future, do not make trouble like this. Chen Pingping can protect you for a while, but he cannot protect you forever. So I warn you, do not get too close to the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian lowered his head. I know, so I need you to remind me from time to time. He knew that his father had always been afraid of him taking over the Overwatch Council, but Fan Xian refused to give up. Fan Jian slowly closed his eyes. This time, you handled the matter very poorly. Even if Guo Baoquan spoke up in the palace and let you guess that the Guo family was actually working for the eldest princess, you shouldn't have done it yourself. If you had told me beforehand, with the power of the Prime Minister and I, we could have used the exam hall's fraud case to get rid of him, and we wouldn't be in this predicament. Fan Xian knew that what his father said was right. If he had taken the risk and joined forces with the Overwatch Council to deal with Minister Guo, it would only have led to an open ending. No one knew what would happen next, and the council would have the initiative. He thought for a moment. Actually, this time, I just wanted to do something that I wanted to do. Perhaps this was just a cheap sense of justice that many people disdained, but Fan Xian still retained a little of it. At present, he was only worried about what Chen Pingping had planned. As if he had guessed what his son was thinking, Fan Jian opened his eyes. There was a trace of comfort and worry in his gaze. You can give up on your fantasies. Chen Pingping will certainly let everyone know that this scandal was single-handedly brought to light by the son of the Fan family. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He knew that his father was right. Chen Pingping was not afraid of the crown prince of the Eastern Palace. As long as he could establish his reputation, as long as he could get closer to controlling the Overwatch Council, he would do anything. Before leaving his son's study, Count Sinan said lightly, in the future, you need to be more mature. You can keep the childish declarations of powerful officials to yourself. There's no need to tell me. Chapter 172. One day at the end of February, a rumor suddenly began to circulate among the officialdom of the capital. The reason why the spring examination fraud case had been so quickly and accurately solved was all because the Overwatch Council had a list of students who had bribed the examinees. And this list had been provided to the Overwatch Council by Master Fan Jr., who was known as the Immortal Poet. It was said that Sir Fan Xian deeply detested the accumulated abuses in the imperial examinations. He was abnormally angry that the diligent scholars of the world could not obtain a fair promotion after 10 years of hard work. That was why he ignored the layers of traps in the officialdom and bravely wrote a memorial to the emperor. He did not hesitate to sell himself to corrupt officials in the court in order to obtain that important list. In short, the rumor was bizarre. It was said that Fan Xian was a man of great wisdom and courage. That list was clearly not a secret, but it was said to be the most sinister piece of paper in Qing officialdom. Fan Xian could tell at a glance that this was the work of those from the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council. As soon as this rumor spread, Fan Xian immediately became a thorn in the side of the officials of the Board of Rights, a thorn in the flesh. But on the other hand, his reputation in the eyes of the common people and the scholars of the world took another step forward. Although the Imperial College and the Tunguen Pavilion maintained their silence, Fan Xian had now become the spiritual leader of the scholars. Fan Xian straightened his collar and sleeves. Isn't this leader a little too new? He then gently patted his sister's worried face. What are you worried about? My brother is one of the most powerful princes in Qing. His voice was very soft, and his words were very strange. But Fan Ruoruo still understood, even though she did not understand the deeper meaning hidden within. Lin Wanner did not hear. Even if she had, she probably would not have understood. In any case, she was not as worried as her sister-in-law. Smiling, she tied the jade rui that the empress had given her to her husband's belt. Pretending to dust it, she said, "Come back soon." It was as Count Sinan had said. Fan Xian was too immature, and had left behind too many problems. Once the rumor spread, Jingo was shocked. Everyone's gaze fell on Fan Xian. Although the people behind the officials who had fallen from power because of the corruption case were wary of Fan Xian's background, they still began to move. That morning, a young censor from the Imperial Censorate had already sent a letter to the palace, accusing Fan Xian of fraud and immoral conduct. Fan Xian had left to go to the Ministry of Justice to be tried. Originally, the cheating case had been investigated by the Overwatch Council, but the officials who had suffered greatly from the scandal were not willing to let the Overwatch Council deal with Fan Xian, so they used the Ministry of Justice's route. The Ministry of Justice had never been on good terms with the Prime Minister, nor did they have any friendship with Fan Xian. The Ministry of Justice had never been on good terms with the Prime Minister, nor did they have any relationship with Fan. Fan Xian looked at the serving girl, whom he hadn't seen much in recent days, and laughed. When I was little, I told you that the words "go well" were not very auspicious. Cici pursed her lips and smiled. Then I hope the young master will leave early and return early. All right. Cook a bowl of millet porridge for the young master to drink. Put in some sweet millet from Danzhou. I haven't tasted your cooking in a long time. Fan Xian suddenly turned his head and asked, "How are the things I asked you to copy?" These days, Fan Xian didn't know how to deal with Cici, who had grown up with him. He also didn't want her to continue being a servant girl in the Fan manor, so he arranged for her to go to the study to help him copy books. Cici had rarely spoken to her young master these days, and her heart was naturally uneasy. Hearing her young master's question, she cheerfully said, "I'm almost done copying." "That's good." Fan Xian nodded and walked out. He smiled at his wife and sister. "Look, the servant girl I brought up is different. She's even calmer than you, Ruoruo." Fan Ruoruo whispered worriedly, "That's because Cici doesn't know how serious today's matter is." It was indeed serious. Fan Xian had offended too many people by exposing the corruption case. Seeing how the court officials were willing to go against the Prime Minister and Count Sinan in order to bring him to the Ministry of Justice, it was obvious how serious the matter was. Exiting the main gate of Fan Manor, the usually quiet street in the south of the city seemed very crowded today. The officials from the Ministry of Justice who had come to arrest him had a worried expression on their faces. They hid behind the stone lions like thieves. At the main gate, Fan Xijia was leading a group of guards and servants from Fan Manor, beating up the officials with long brooms in their hands. On the street, many scholars and commoners who had heard that Fan Xian was going to be put on trial had swarmed in. They already knew that Fan Xian had something to do with the scandal that had shaken the capital's officialdom. The commoners' simple minds didn't care about what was behind the scandal. They only knew that Fan Xian was talented, kind, and a good man. But a good man was going to be put on trial today, so they all felt wronged on Fan Xian's behalf. Fan Xian stood at the gate and smiled as he looked at the crowd outside the manor. He saw that most of them were young scholars, and he knew that Chen Pingping's trick had worked. He whispered to Ting Zijing, who was beside him. "Where are Shi Chanli and the other 3 now?" According to the young master's orders, they are currently being secretly protected by the Overwatch Council. Sir Wang Qinian suggested that the 4 should be sent to King Jing's manor, lest the court officials use this matter to frame you. But I believe that the young master doesn't want to have anything to do with Crown Prince Jing, so I declined, Ting Zijing replied in a low voice. Fan Xian looked at Ting Zijing with some surprise. He hadn't expected the man to guess the situation he least wanted to see. If he sent the 4 scholars to King Jing's manor, it seemed safe, but in the eyes of the Eastern Palace, exposing the scandal would no longer be purely out of a sense of justice and His Majesty's edict. Instead, it would be to stand on the side of the second prince and attack the crown prince. If that happened, the relationship between him and the Eastern Palace would be irreconcilable. Seeing Fan Xian walk out of the manor gate, the surrounding scholars burst into cheers. They all surged forward and shouted something. It was nothing more than to express their admiration and support for Sir Fan Jr.'s righteous shoulders. Fan Xian smiled like a star from his previous life and waved his hand. He said quietly to Ting Zijing, "The biggest problem with scholars is that they are too simple." Ting Zijing smiled and didn't say anything. Fan Xian suddenly laughed happily. "If there's a chance in the future, do you want to leave the capital and become an official? With the power of your family, it's not a problem to make sure you become a 6th or 7th level parent." Ting Zijing was surprised. Although he had been educated, he had always been a guard. Why did the young master want to become an official? But then he remembered that the young master might need someone he could trust in the provinces of the kingdom of Qing. After a pause, he replied, "It's all up to you, young master." "Up to me?" Fan Xian laughed. "It's a pity that the kingdom of Qing doesn't have Bailing County." Fan Xian's face had always been clear and beautiful. Now that he was laughing heartily, it was even more radiant, like a spring breeze. The scholars who had come to support him felt very gratified. The immortal poet Fan Xian should look like this. He rubbed Fan Xija's head and told his brother not to cause trouble. Only then did he politely bid farewell to the officials of the Ministry of Justice, get into his own carriage, and head for the Ministry of Justice. The crowd gradually dispersed, and the scholars who were rushing to take the exam also chased after the yamen of the Ministry of Justice. No one noticed that Fan Manor's valiant guards were escorting another carriage out of the southern street of the city, heading in the direction of the royal palace. Lin Wan sat in the carriage. Last night, she and Fan Xian had discussed this in bed. Today, she had to go to the palace to explain things to the Eastern Palace and the other palaces. Elsewhere, Fan Xian was alone. He walked into the main hall of the Ministry of Justice. The hall was a little gloomy. The wind whistled in, and the early spring weather made him feel a little cold. But he still smiled and cupped his hands in salute to the 3 people sitting high above. "Greetings, sir." The spring examination fraud case was a big deal, and Fan Xian was a key figure in it. So other than the Minister of Justice, there were also 2 high-ranking officials from the Supreme Court and the Imperial Censorate. On both sides of the hall, there was a row of officials from the 13 yamens. It was a frightening sight. Fan Xian frowned, realizing that the other party had not replied. After a while, he suddenly heard a shout. The Minister of Justice, Han Jiwei, asked coldly, "Is the person standing in the hall the fifth-level Imperial scholar Fan Xian of the Imperial College?" Fan Xian was no longer the young calf who had just entered Jingdo with a smile on his face in the Jingdo government. He glanced at the minister and lightly said, "That is me. I called you here today to inquire about the spring examination." Fan Xian smiled and said, "As far as I know, the spring examination fraud case was handled by the Overwatch Council by imperial edict. I didn't know the Ministry of Justice was involved." Hearing this rude reply, the three officials sitting high above were furious. But they knew that the man in front of them was at the height of his popularity. He had the Prime Minister and a minister behind him. After the fraud case, he had gained the respect of the scholars, so they couldn't do anything to him. The Minister of Justice, Han Jiwei, had always prided himself on being sober and honest. He couldn't stand such arrogance. He snorted and said, "I am handling this case under imperial edict. Don't make excuses." Fan Xian shook his head. "I am not making excuses. I just don't know why you have summoned me here. If you are asking about the details of the spring examination fraud case, I am sorry. The Overwatch Council has strict orders that before the case is closed, I am not allowed to reveal it." The Minister of Justice was so angry that he laughed. "Are you not going to answer the court's questions? The Overwatch Council is a part of the court, and the Ministry of Justice is a part of the court." Fan Xian sighed. "As you know, this matter involves too many people. I really don't know how to handle it. The laws of Qing do not make it clear." You're tuning into the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.